Hey guys, tonight we're snuggling down, maybe under a nice fluffy duvet, perhaps with a pillow fluffed just right, probably in a bed all to yourself, in a room that's exclusively your space. You close your eyes, feel the soft mattress yielding just so, and drift off, blissfully unaware of anyone else's elbows or knees or, frankly, their questionable foot hygiene. Ah, modern luxury. But what if I told you that this solitary sleeping experience, this sanctuary of personal space you probably take completely for granted, is a very recent historical anomaly? For the vast, overwhelming majority of human history, if you wanted to catch some Z's, you were doing it nose to armpit with other people, like a lot of other people. And honestly, judging by the average historical living conditions, you probably wouldn't survive more than a night or two before giving up and offering yourself to the local wildlife. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight and what time it is for you right now. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's peel back the layers of time, venturing back to the very dawn of human existence, to a time when the concept of a bed, as we know it, didn't exist, and personal space was less a right and more a hilarious theoretical concept. We're talking about the deep past, when your ancestors weren't tucking into twin beds or king-size mattresses. They were huddling, seriously, just huddling. Imagine for a moment you're in a cave, or maybe just a slightly sheltered overhang. It's cold, it's dark. There are definitely things out there that want to eat you. You don't have central heating or even a sturdy door. Your best bet for survival? Proximity. Piling together a tangle of human limbs and maybe a few slightly domesticated wolves. Hey, early cohabitation had perks, I guess. Creating a warm, breathing mass. Sleep in these earliest times wasn't about comfort or privacy. It was a functional necessity performed within a defensive cluster. You slept together because it was safer. More eyes or ears or noses to detect danger, more bodies to generate warmth in chilling temperatures. It was the original safety in numbers approach, applied quite literally to bedtime. Your neighbor's snoring might have been annoying, but at least they were an extra obstacle between you and the saber-toothed cat outside. A small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. This wasn't just about warmth, although that was a huge factor, especially in colder climates before sophisticated shelter and fire management were perfected. It was also about social cohesion and protection within the group. Sleeping together reinforced bonds, maintained social hierarchy, maybe the alpha got the warmest spot in the middle, and ensured that the group was ready to react together if threatened. There was no concept of individual vulnerability during sleep. Your vulnerability was the group's vulnerability, and you mitigated that by being a tightly packed unit. Think of it like a historical mosh pit, but for sleeping. Less jumping, more uncomfortable hip bones digging into your ribs. As early humans transitioned, very gradually, from purely nomadic hunter-gatherers to more settled agricultural communities, shelter evolved. Mud huts, reed dwellings, simple stone structures. But even then, space was at a premium. These early homes were typically small, often consisting of a single multi-purpose room. This mainstream historical fact is key. This one room was where you cooked, ate, socialized, worked on tools, and yes, slept. There were no dedicated bedrooms. The entire family, sometimes extended family, possibly even livestock on particularly chilly nights, talk about a noisy roommate, shared this single living space. Bedding might be straw, animal hides, or simple woven mats laid out on the floor. You just find a spot, curl up next to whoever was there, and hope for the best. Sleep wasn't a solitary retreat. It was just another communal activity, like sharing a meal or chipping flint. This communal sleeping arrangement wasn't just a feature of the earliest human groups. It persisted and adapted across many ancient societies. In the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, early urban centers saw people living in closer proximity than ever before. Homes in ancient Mesopotamia or Egypt, while sometimes more complex than simple huts, still often house multiple family members across generations in relatively confined spaces. Sleeping areas were often simply designated parts of rooms rather than separate chambers. You might unroll your mat or lay out your blanket on the floor, perhaps on a raised platform if you were lucky, right alongside your parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Forget sneaking out after bedtime. Your entire family was literally right there. The level of surveillance must have been incredible. Privacy, as we conceive it today, the ability to be truly alone, especially during vulnerable states like sleep, was simply not a feature of daily life for the vast majority of people for thousands upon thousands of years. The structure of these ancient societies reinforced this shared sleeping practice. Family units were paramount, and life was lived communally. There was less emphasis on the individual and more on the collective. Your identity, your safety, and your daily routines were intertwined with your family and community group. Sleeping together was a physical manifestation of this interconnectedness. It wasn't seen as an inconvenience. It was just the natural order of things. It's like being on a never-ending family camping trip, except the tent is made of mud and there's no escape from your uncle's snoring. Or the goats. Historians still argue whether this constant physical proximity fostered closer emotional bonds within families and communities, or if the sheer lack of personal space created different kinds of social tensions we don't fully understand today. It's hard for us to imagine the psychological impact of never, ever being truly alone, especially during the vulnerable hours of sleep. Was it comforting or was it stifling? Probably a bit of both, depending on the day and who you were sharing your patch of floor with. Did sibling rivalries escalate faster when you literally couldn't get away from each other, even at night? Did family secrets stay secrets for longer, or were they impossible to keep when someone was always within earshot? These are the kind of questions that keep the historical community buzzing, or at least mildly interested during coffee breaks. A quirky tidbit from ancient Egypt illustrates this lack of dedicated sleeping furniture. While the wealthy elite might have had raised wooden beds, often more for status or to avoid pests on the floor, the average Egyptian likely slept on mats or simple mattresses stuffed with straw or wool, laid directly on the floor or on low platforms. These sleeping areas weren't in private bedrooms. They were usually just corners of the main living space. So even when they had some form of bedding, it was integrated into the communal area. Imagine rolling up your bed every morning so the space could be used for grinding grain or weaving. Your bedroom was also the living room, the kitchen, and probably the workshop. Multitasking furniture wasn't a design choice. It was a life necessity. And the idea of spending hundreds or thousands on a fancy bed frame, utterly absurd to someone who just needed a spot on the floor that wasn't too lumpy or buggy. Necessity truly drove these arrangements. Fire was precious, used for cooking, light, and warmth. Huddling together maximized the warmth from a single hearth. Security was paramount. A group could defend itself better than scattered individuals. Space was limited. Building materials and land weren't always abundant, and consolidating living functions was efficient. Structure also played a part. Family units were the primary social and economic structure, and living and sleeping together reinforced those bonds and dependencies. You lived, worked, and slept as a unit. There wasn't much room, literally or figuratively, for the concept of the solitary individual, especially during the vulnerable hours of rest. Think about the sheer noise level, too. Snoring, human and animal, sleep talking, babies crying, people getting up for water or a bathroom break, which involved going outside, likely. Sleep wasn't a quiet, isolated activity. It was a symphony of humanity and livestock. You developed an ability to sleep through anything, or you simply didn't sleep well. It makes our modern complaints about noisy neighbors seem a little, precious, doesn't it? Oh no, I can hear my upstairs neighbor walking around. Your ancestors would have given anything for that level of quiet isolation. They were dealing with someone else's goat breathing heavily in their ear. So as we picture these ancient scenes, remember that the simple act of going to sleep was a fundamentally different experience. It was public, it was communal, and it was dictated by the harsh realities of survival and the structure of early human societies. It wasn't about your comfort or your personal space. It was about the survival and cohesion of the group. And this wasn't just a fleeting phase. This pattern of shared communal sleeping spaces would endure, evolving but not disappearing, for thousands of years to come, right up into periods that feel much closer to our own time. We're just scratching the surface of how deeply embedded shared sleeping was in human history. Picking up from those early, huddled masses, we move forward, centuries and millennia rolling by like waves on a shore, eventually washing us onto the sun-drenched, marble-strewn landscapes of classical antiquity. We're talking ancient Greece and Rome now. Civilizations with complex societies, impressive architecture, philosophical debates, and still a surprising amount of communal sleeping. You might picture grand villas or bustling cities and assume that with greater wealth and sophistication came private bedrooms for everyone. And sure, if you were absolutely loaded like a Roman senator with estates galore, you might have had a dedicated cubiculum, a bedroom more or less. But even then, the idea of it being exclusively yours and used only for sleeping wasn't quite the norm we think of today. For the vast majority of Greeks and Romans, from merchants and artisans in the cities to farmers in the countryside, home life remained a shared experience, and that absolutely extended to bedtime. Think about a typical Roman domus, a house for a reasonably well-off family. It might have multiple rooms, yes, unlike the single-room huts of earlier times, but these rooms often weren't specialized in the way ours are. The triclinium, for instance, was the dining room, famous for its 3 couches where people reclined to eat. But guess what? Those couches, or similar pieces of furniture, lectus, were also used for sleeping, reading, socializing, and even doing business. So your dining room could easily become your bedroom at night. Talk about dual-purpose furniture. It makes assembling an IKEA couch feel like building the pyramids. This mainstream historical fact is crucial. The Roman lectus wasn't just a bed. It was a versatile piece of furniture integral to Roman life. It could be a dining couch, a daybed, or a nightbed. And crucially, these weren't typically single beds. A dining lectus in a triclinium was designed to hold 3 people reclining. While a sleeping lectus might be smaller, it was still common for multiple people to share one, especially family members or enslaved people. Imagine a sectional sofa that you also ate dinner on and then slept on with 2 other people. Sounds cozy and potentially crumb-filled. Even in homes with designated cubicula, these rooms were often small and might still be shared by multiple individuals. Children certainly shared rooms, often with siblings or other relatives. Enslaved members of the household would sleep wherever space allowed, often in corridors, workshops, or shared small rooms, frequently on the floor or on simple pallets. Even free members of a household, perhaps adult children or dependent relatives, might share sleeping quarters. The concept of every individual having their own private room, their own bed, was just not a feature of everyday life. Space was often limited, especially in crowded urban environments, and maximizing the use of every room was essential. In ancient Greece, similar patterns existed. The oikos, or household, was the fundamental unit of society, encompassing family, property, and enslaved people. Homes varied greatly depending on wealth, but even relatively comfortable houses often had a central courtyard and various rooms opening off it. Specific rooms for sleeping weren't always common. People would lay out bedding, mats, blankets, animal skins in different parts of the house depending on the season, time of day, or who was visiting. Men and women often slept in separate quarters or areas within the house, a form of segregation that offered a different kind of privacy than our modern individual concept. But it was still within a shared gendered space rather than a truly solitary one. It was more about separating groups than isolating individuals. Consider the sensory experience. In a Roman domus, even at night, you wouldn't be alone with your thoughts. You'd hear the rustling of others shifting on their lectus, the soft breathing of your couch mates, perhaps the creak of furniture as someone got up. Smells would mingle, residual cooking odors from the day, the scent of oil lamps, the undeniable aroma of multiple unwashed bodies sharing a confined space. Hygiene standards weren't exactly what we're used to. The idea of fresh sheets might have meant shaking out the straw. A quirky tidbit from Roman life adds another layer to this. while the elite had their lekti, even in public spaces like inns, kapane, or taberne, travelers would share large rooms or even just floor space. If you were on the road in Roman times, you absolutely did not expect a private room. You'd pay for a spot in a communal sleeping area, often sharing with strangers, merchants, soldiers, other travelers, maybe even their livestock. Yes, that again. It was essentially a historical hostel, but with fewer charging outlets and significantly more fleas. Sleep was literally a public or semi-public activity, just like eating at a public cookshop or using the public baths. Historians still argue whether the constant proximity enforced by these communal living and sleeping arrangements fostered a different kind of social intimacy and family bond compared to modern, more isolated living. Did growing up sharing a room, a bed, maybe even a dining couch with your siblings and parents create a more tightly knit family unit? Or did the lack of personal space lead to different forms of conflict or repression? It's difficult to fully grasp the psychological landscape of people who never experienced true solitude within their home, especially during vulnerable moments like sleep. We can only infer based on the evidence, and that evidence points overwhelmingly to a life lived in close physical contact with others, day and night. Think about how different childhood must have been. No sneaking a flashlight under the covers to read. No private whispered secrets with a best friend during a sleepover, unless everyone else in the room was a heavy sleeper. Your parents were right there. Your grandparents might be right there. Your cousins might be right there. Every interaction, every argument, every moment of vulnerability was potentially observed or overheard by multiple people. It created a different social dynamic, one where the group was always present, always watching, always sharing your space, even in the dead of night. It put a whole new spin on the phrase, "the walls have ears." In ancient homes, the beds had ears. Even in elite households, while there might be more rooms, the dynamics of shared space persisted. A wealthy Roman matron might have her own cubiculum, but she would likely share it with enslaved attendants who would be on hand day and night. Her children, as mentioned, would share rooms. The master of the house might have a study or private space, but his sleeping arrangements might still involve proximity to others, perhaps guards or attendants sleeping just outside his door, or even sharing the same large room. Solitary sleep was a rarity, a luxury almost unimaginable for most. The concept of going to bed didn't involve retreating to a personal sanctuary. It involved finding your spot in the communal sleeping area, whether that was laying out a mat on the floor, claiming your space on a shared lectus, or settling down in a designated corner of a room. It was a functional transition from one shared activity, daytime work, socializing, eating, to another shared activity, sleep. The house didn't become quiet and empty of others. It just transitioned into its nighttime sleeping configuration, with bodies arranged throughout the available space. The bedding itself also tells a story. Simple mats, straw pallets, wool blankets, animal hides. Mattresses, if they existed, were likely stuffed with less than luxurious materials like straw, reeds, or wool, and would need regular airing out or replacement due to pests and general wear and tear. Imagine the collective rustling as everyone shifted in their straw beds. It sounds like a historical ASMR track titled "The Sound of 100 People Trying to Get Comfortable on Hay." Not exactly soothing, the practicalities of daily life dictated these arrangements. Heating was inefficient and often centered around a single hearth or brazier. Huddling together maximized the warmth. Lighting was limited to oil lamps, expensive and dim. Communal activities, including preparing for sleep, happened in shared, semi-lit spaces. Security remained a concern, particularly in less secure areas or during times of unrest. Sleeping in groups offered protection. Economic realities meant that building large homes with many specialized rooms was beyond the reach of most. Even in affluent homes, labor was often organized communally, with enslaved people or employees living within the household structure, further contributing to the shared living and sleeping spaces. So, while we might think of ancient Greece and Rome as the height of classical civilization, stepping into one of their homes at bedtime would be a stark reminder of how different their concept of privacy and personal space was. It wasn't about having your own room with a "do not disturb" sign. It was about finding your place within the collective and sharing that space, including your sleeping space, with everyone else under that roof. And this pattern, this deep-seated historical norm of communal sleeping, didn't just vanish with the decline of the Roman Empire. It flowed forward, evolving and adapting, but remaining a fundamental aspect of how people rested for centuries to come. The idea of my bed was still a long way off for most people. Leaving the sun-drenched world of Rome behind, we step into a different kind of era. One often painted in shades of gray and brown, the period stretching from the fall of the Western Roman Empire through the Middle Ages. Life changed dramatically for many. Sure, societal structures shifted, empires rose and fell, but one thing remained remarkably consistent with the practices we just explored. Your sleeping arrangements were still highly unlikely to involve a private room of your own. We're talking about a world where personal space, especially at night, was a concept far in the future. Imagine the typical home, particularly in the earlier part of this period, often called the Dark Ages. Though historians debate how dark it really was, it certainly wasn't big on personal lamplit bedrooms. For most people, whether a humble farmer or even a minor lord, home was likely a relatively simple structure. Think wattle and daub walls, thatched roofs, maybe a dirt floor. And frequently it was a single, multi-purpose room. This room was your kitchen, your living area, your workshop, and yes, your bedroom. All rolled into one drafty, potentially smoky, and certainly crowded space. Even for the wealthier, living spaces centered around a large hall, the aula or great hall. This was the heart of the home, where people ate, socialized, conducted business, and where the Lord dispensed justice. And when night fell, it transformed into a mass sleeping area. The long tables used for dining might be pushed aside or even slept on. Benches became beds, and most people would unroll their bedding on the floor. We're not talking about a quiet, private retreat. We're talking about dozens, perhaps scores, of people settling down for the night in the same large room. This mainstream historical fact is undeniable. The Great Hall served as the primary communal sleeping space in medieval castles and manor houses for centuries. Everyone from the lord and lady, sometimes in a slightly raised or separated area, but often still in the hall, to knights, squires, servants, guests, and even passing travelers or beggars seeking shelter, would find a spot on the floor or a bench in the hall. The social hierarchy might be rigid during the day, but at night everyone was piled in together. It's the ultimate historical slumber party, except without the pizza and questionable movie choices, and with a much higher risk of stepping on someone's face in the dark. The sensory experience was intense. The smell of the day's cooking would linger, mingling with the smoke from the central hearth, which provided warmth and light, but also a constant haze. The scent of unwashed bodies, damp earth, and maybe even the livestock often kept nearby, or sometimes even inside the home for warmth and security. The noise wouldn't just be snoring. You'd hear shifting bodies, whispered conversations, the sounds of the house settling, maybe the rustle of straw bedding, and the general background hum of many people sharing a confined space. It would have been a far cry from the silent sanctity of a modern bedroom. Bedding was simple. Straw or rushes spread on the floor served as a base for warmth and insulation, though they also harbored pests like fleas and lice. On top of this, people would place mats, animal skins, or simple cloth stuffed with wool or feathers for wealthier individuals. Blankets were typically wool. There was no concept of a sprung mattress or fitted sheets. Bedding was functional, designed for warmth and a slight buffer from the hard floor, not for luxurious comfort. And given the communal nature and limited resources, like water for washing, cleanliness was a constant battle, often lost. Imagine the sheer amount of scratching that must have gone on. It's like a historical symphony of itch. As the Middle Ages progressed, particularly from the High Medieval period onwards, say the 12th century onwards, you start to see changes, especially in the homes of the elite. Castles and manor houses became more complex. Rooms began to be specialized, and the concept of a private chamber started to emerge. This chamber, or solarium, might be upstairs off the main hall or in a separate wing. It represented a move towards slightly more exclusive space for the lord and lady of the household. But don't mistake this for modern privacy. The chamber was rarely just a bedroom. It was a multi-purpose private apartment where the lord and lady might receive important guests, conduct private business, dress, and also sleep. And critically, they were almost never alone. Attendants, personal servants, sometimes even close family members or favored guards, would sleep in the chamber with them or on pallets just outside the door. The lord might have his bed, often a grand, canopied affair symbolizing his status, but his squires might be sleeping on the floor at the foot of it. The lady might have her bed, but her waiting women would be nearby. Privacy was about controlling who was in your immediate vicinity, not about being truly alone. For the vast majority of the population, the peasants who made up the bulk of society, the growing urban populations of merchants, artisans, and laborers, these changes in elite homes meant nothing. Their homes remained small, often single-room dwellings where the entire family slept together. Parents, children, grandparents, unmarried siblings, maybe even farmhands or apprentices living with the family. Everyone shared the same space, laying out their bedding on the floor around the hearth. There might be some segregation by age or gender if space allowed, perhaps men on one side, women and children on another. But it was still a communal sleeping experience within the family unit. A quirky tidbit relates to the practice of bundling or courting in bed, which persisted in some rural areas well into later centuries, but has roots in this period. This involved unmarried couples sharing a bed fully clothed, often with a bundling board or bolster between them, supposedly to allow for courtship and conversation under supervision while conserving warmth and light, without the expectation of sexual activity. Historians debate its exact prevalence and purity, but the very concept highlights how different the norms around shared beds were. Imagine asking your parents if you could have a date in your bed with a board. Probably wouldn't go over well today. Historians still argue whether the constant proximity enforced by communal sleeping created different psychological and social dynamics than modern individualistic sleeping arrangements. Did it foster greater family cohesion and community ties? Or did it lead to increased tension, lack of individual identity, or repression of personal feelings? It's hard to measure the emotional impact across centuries, but it's clear that medieval people experienced sleep in the transition into it as a fundamentally social act, not a private one. You were always part of the group, even in slumber. The reasons for this widespread communal sleeping were pragmatic. Warmth was a primary driver. Homes were poorly insulated, and huddling together was the most effective way to stay warm on cold nights, especially with limited fuel for the hearth. Security was another factor. Sleeping in a group offered protection against intruders, whether human or animal. Space was also limited, especially in built-up areas, making single-room or shared-room living a necessity. Lighting was poor and expensive, candles and oil lamps, so it made sense for everyone to congregate around the main source of light and heat in the evening before settling down together. And the social structure itself, where servants and retainers were integral parts of the household, reinforced the idea of shared living spaces. Even medieval inns, like their Roman predecessors, offered communal sleeping. You'd pay for a place to sleep, which often meant a spot on the floor in a large room shared with all the other travelers, or maybe a place on a large shared bed known as a truckle or trundle bed, or even a shared main bed if you were willing to pay a bit more but still potentially sharing with a stranger. You were absolutely not guaranteed a private room. Sleep was just another communal activity you paid for a share in. You might wake up next to a traveling merchant, a weary pilgrim, or someone who definitely hadn't bathed recently. It was the medieval equivalent of couch surfing, but less intentional and probably smellier. The beds themselves, even the more elaborate ones in the later medieval period, often featured heavy curtains or canopies. While these might seem like a step towards privacy, they were primarily for insulation against drafts and to keep out insects and potentially dust or debris falling from the ceiling. They created a microclimate environment within the larger shared room, a small pocket of warmth and slightly cleaner air, but they didn't create solitude. Behind those curtains, you might still have a spouse, children, or servants sharing the space within, or sleeping just beyond the fabric barrier. The concept of a child having their own bedroom was almost entirely unheard of, regardless of social class. Children slept with their parents until they were old enough to sleep with siblings or other children's servants in the household. It was a practical arrangement based on warmth, supervision, and space limitations. Childhood sleep wasn't a solitary retreat, it was integrated into the bustling, shared life of the home. So as you can see, stepping into a medieval bedroom would have been a far cry from the quiet, private sanctuary we envision today. It was a crowded, often noisy, sometimes smelly, and always communal space. Whether you were a king or a peasant, your nights were spent in close proximity to others. The boundaries between personal space and shared existence blurred by the realities of medieval life. And while the wealthy slowly started carving out slightly more exclusive chambers in the later period, the fundamental practice of shared sleeping remained the norm for the vast majority, setting the stage for how people would continue to rest for centuries to come, before the slow, gradual shift towards our modern, solitary sleep began its hesitant journey. Moving past the smoky, crowded communal halls of the Middle Ages, we find ourselves stepping, ever so slowly, into a new era, the early modern period, roughly from the 1500s through the 1700s. Think Renaissance, age of exploration, flamboyant fashion, and powdered wigs. While the world outside was undergoing massive transformations, life inside the home, particularly for the vast majority of people, remained remarkably consistent with the past. For peasants, farmers, and most town dwellers, the small, multi-purpose family dwelling where everyone slept together remained the norm. Your parents, your siblings, maybe your grandma and grandpa, perhaps an apprentice or a farmhand, you were all still cozying up together or at least sharing the same room on different mats or pallets. The lack of space, the need for shared warmth, and the practicalities of limited resources hadn't magically disappeared just because someone invented doublets. However, for the elite, the nobility, wealthy merchants, royalty, this period marked the hesitant beginning of a shift, a slow, creaking movement away from the complete lack of personal nocturnal space. While they hadn't suddenly discovered the joys of the modern, solitary bedroom, they were starting to differentiate rooms within their increasingly elaborate homes. The Great Hall was still important, a place for receiving guests and dining, but other rooms started to gain specific functions, and chief among these, in terms of privacy, or at least exclusivity, was the emerging concept of the bedchamber. This is our mainstream historical fact for this section. The early modern period saw the gradual establishment of the bedchamber as a distinct, specialized room within the homes of the wealthy elite, separate from the main public spaces like the Great Hall. Now, before you imagine a lock on the door and a "Do Not Disturb" sign, let's be clear, this room was still miles away from your modern bedroom. It was multifunctional, serving as a private sitting room, a place for receiving close guests, a dressing room, and also the place where the most important members of the household slept. The shift wasn't instantaneous, and it didn't happen everywhere at once. But as wealth accumulated and architectural styles evolved, houses, especially palaces and grand manor homes, grew larger and more complex. Corridors and staircases began connecting rooms designed for specific purposes, moving away from the medieval model of one large hall with perhaps a few small solar rooms tacked on. The bedchamber became the central, most private, relative term, apartment for the lord and lady of the house. But who was in there with you? Oh, pretty much everyone who mattered in your immediate service circle. You weren't alone. You'd have personal servants, valets, ladies' maids, pages, sleeping on pallets on the floor of the bedchamber itself, or in an adjoining small room or closet, always ready to assist you. They helped you dress, undress, prepare for bed, and were on hand throughout the night. Guests of honor might sometimes be offered a spot in the bedchamber or an adjacent room. Even family members might share the space. Privacy meant you controlled who was allowed in this specific, more restricted room, not that you were ever truly by yourself when the lights went out, or rather when the candles were snuffed. The beds themselves became increasingly elaborate symbols of status. Think enormous, heavy wooden frames, often carved and decorated. The most iconic feature was the heavy, luxurious fabric, velvet, silk, brocade, used for hangings, curtains, and canopies. These weren't just decorative, they were functional. Remember the drafts and insects from the last section? These heavy curtains provided crucial insulation against the cold and created a relatively sealed-off microclimate, helping to keep you warm and hopefully keep the majority of the creepy crawlies out. Sleeping inside your massive curtained bed was like having a tent within a room, and that room was still often shared. So you'd climb into your enormous, possibly uncomfortable, heavily draped bed, perhaps after a lengthy ritual of undressing and preparing for the night, assisted by your servants who would then bed down nearby. It wasn't a silent, solitary retreat. You'd hear the rustle of your servants settling onto their pallets, their breathing, maybe hushed conversations. The sounds of the house wouldn't be entirely shut out either. The concept of thick, soundproof walls wasn't really a thing. You were just in a slightly more exclusive space than the main hall. A quirky tidbit from this era relates to the ceremonial nature of the bedchamber and the bed itself. In wealthy and royal households, the bedchamber wasn't just where you slept. It was a semi-public space where important daily rituals took place. The lever, waking up, and coucher, going to bed, ceremonies at places like the French court, were highly formalized events attended by select courtiers. The King of France, Louis XIV, for example, had dozens of people involved in the elaborate ritual of him simply getting out of bed in the morning or getting into it at night. His magnificent state bed wasn't just for sleeping, it was a stage for demonstrating power and status. Imagine having dozens of people watch you brush your teeth, if they did that, and put on your pajamas. Slightly awkward. It really highlights how the bedchamber was about status and accessibility to the powerful, not just personal sleep. While the elite were experimenting with bedchambers, the vast majority of the population continued to sleep communally out of necessity. The little cottage or urban tenement housed the whole family in one or two rooms. The warmth of bodies sleeping together was often essential for survival during cold winters. Security was still a concern. A single, tightly packed space was easier to defend than multiple dispersed rooms. And let's not forget the sheer cost of building materials, heating fuel, and lighting. A single-room dwelling around a central hearth was simply the most economical way to live and sleep for most people. The idea of dedicating an entire room solely to the act of sleeping, heated and lit just for that purpose, was an unimaginable luxury for the common person. Historians still argue whether the emergence of the bedchamber in elite homes was primarily driven by a growing desire for personal privacy, or if it was more about demonstrating wealth and status by having dedicated spaces that required more complex architecture and staffing. Was it a psychological shift towards valuing solitude, or simply another way for the rich to show off? It's likely a mix of factors, with evolving social norms playing a part, but the practicalities of display and managing a large household certainly seems central to the initial development of these more specialized rooms. The journey towards genuine private bedrooms was still a long way off. While the bedchamber offered a degree of exclusivity compared to the open hall, it didn't offer solitude. You might be tucked away in your curtained bed, a grand piece of furniture loaded with symbolic meaning, but you were still surrounded by your household, sleeping, breathing, and occasionally snoring nearby. It was a step, perhaps, towards the modern concept of personal space, but a very small one, and one taken only by a privileged few. Think of it this way. If you lived in this era, unless you were born into extreme wealth or nobility, your nightly routine would still involve finding a spot on the floor or a shared mat next to your family members, just as it had been for centuries. Your bedroom was the main room of your house. For the lucky few in their elaborate bedchambers, it was a step up, but still a world away from closing the door and being completely alone. You were shifting from a communal slumber party in the hall to a slightly more exclusive, servant-attended slumber party in a designated room. Progress maybe, but not exactly the peaceful, solitary retreat you might crave tonight. And this pattern of the wealthy carving out slightly more exclusive sleeping spaces while the masses continued communal sleeping would persist for quite some time. As the calendars turned and the powdered wigs got even taller, we sail into the 18th century. This was the age of enlightenment, a time of reason, philosophy, and a burgeoning sense of individualism, at least if you were part of the educated or wealthy classes. Outwardly, Society was becoming more refined, more obsessed with manners and appearances. Inwardly, within the homes of those who could afford it, ideas about comfort, convenience, and yes, even a whisper of privacy started to take root. While the grand curtained bedchamber remained a fixture for the elite, houses were continuing their architectural evolution. The big, multi-purpose hall of medieval times was firmly a relic of the past for the upper crust. Instead, homes became a network of increasingly specialized rooms. You now had drawing rooms for entertaining, dining rooms for eating, shocking, I know, libraries for reading, and so on. And within this layout, the number and arrangement of sleeping spaces also began to diversify, moving ever so slightly towards segregation. Our mainstream historical fact for this section is this. The 18th century saw a significant increase in the differentiation and specialization of rooms within larger homes, which included the provision of more dedicated sleeping areas, even if those areas still often housed multiple beds or occupants. It wasn't just a bedchamber anymore. A substantial house might have multiple bedchambers, rooms specifically designated for sleeping, for various family members or important guests, distinct from the main social rooms. This meant, for the wealthy, the principal couple might have their main bedchamber, perhaps with a dressing room or closet attached. Children, especially older ones, might have their own rooms or share a room with a sibling rather than sleeping on a mat in their parents' space. Guests were increasingly given their own room, even if it was a small one, rather than being expected to share the host bed or bedchamber floor. This wasn't universal and depends heavily on the size and wealth of the household. But the trend towards assigning specific rooms for specific purposes, including sleeping, was undeniable among those with the means. Now, don't picture everyone suddenly getting their own twin bed and poster collection. Even these dedicated sleeping areas were often still shared. It was common for siblings to share a bedchamber, sometimes even a bed, well into their teens or beyond. Servants, as we've already touched on, were still very much present. Senior servants might have a small room near their employers, but most of the household staff still slept communally, in attics, basements, hallways, or crowded shared rooms, often on the floor or on simple cots. Remember those poor souls sleeping on pallets from Section 4? They were still very much a reality. The idea of privacy, as we understand it, the right to be alone and undisturbed, was a luxury that only truly began to gain cultural traction among the enlightened minds and the moneyed classes of this era. Philosophers wrote about the individual, and this slowly translated into domestic aspirations. Having a space where you weren't constantly under the gaze of others, even family or servants, became something desirable, a mark of status and refinement. However, old habits, especially those steeped in practicality and social custom, died hard. A quirky tidbit from this era that might seem utterly bizarre to us is the continuation, especially earlier in the century, of the custom of receiving visitors in the bedchamber. Yes, even as spaces became more private, the bedchamber wasn't exclusively a place for sleep or intimate family life. A fashionable lady might hold a receiving while still in bed or only partially dressed, surrounded by close friends and acquaintances who would gather to chat and gossip. It was a highly social, almost theatrical event, completely at odds with our modern notion of the bedroom as a strictly personal sanctuary. It served to illustrate that while the room was becoming more exclusive in terms of who slept there, its function during the day could still be surprisingly public, blurring the lines between private space and social stage. Imagine your friends popping over for a chat while you're still in your pajamas, propped up on pillows. Awkward, but apparently quite the thing if you were upper crust back then. The beds themselves continued to evolve, becoming slightly more comfortable. Four-poster beds with heavy curtains remained popular, still serving that crucial function of insulating against drafts and creating a microclimate, but also acting as a room within a room, offering a visual barrier even if others were present. Mattresses filled with horsehair, feathers, or wool became more common for those who could afford them, a step up from straw or rags, though still a far cry from modern memory foam. Sleeping naked was still the norm for many, though night clothes slowly gained popularity. The simple act of preparing for bed or waking up was still often a semi-public affair assisted by servants, reinforcing that complete solitude was not yet the default setting. For the vast majority of people, farmers, laborers, craftsmen, shopkeepers, life hadn't changed quite so dramatically. Their homes were typically smaller, often just one or two rooms. The primary living space, heated by a central hearth, still served as the main sleeping area for the entire family and perhaps a few apprentices or lodgers. The practicality of shared warmth, the economy of space, and the simple affordability of building materials meant that communal or tightly packed sleeping arrangements remained the norm out of necessity. The notion of dedicating an entire room to just one or two people for sleeping purposes was an unimaginable extravagance. Even when families occupied homes with more than one room, these rooms were often multifunctional. A room might be used for weaving during the day, eating in the evening, and sleeping at night. Beds might be simple, straw-filled sacks on the floor, pallets pulled out each night, or built-in bunks. Privacy wasn't a concept that held much sway in these crowded conditions. Practicality and survival were paramount. You slept where there was space, where there was warmth, and among the people you lived and worked with. The sounds of the household settling down for the night, coughs, snores, creaking floors, the rustle of straw, were the soundtrack to your rest. Historians still argue whether the growing emphasis on privacy and specialized rooms in the 18th century elite home was a genuine reflection of changing social values and a nascent desire for personal solitude, or if it was simply a consequence of increasing wealth and the ability to afford larger, more complex houses and the staff to maintain them. Was it a shift in the idea of domestic life, or just a practical outcome of having more space and money? It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Did they want privacy, so they built bigger houses? Or did building bigger houses make privacy a possibility they then came to value? Regardless of the primary driver, the seeds of our modern understanding of private space were being sown, albeit only in fertile, wealthy ground. The idea that different activities should happen in different rooms, and that perhaps, just perhaps, sleeping could be a slightly more personal affair, was gaining traction among a minority. You can see this shift reflected in architecture books and household manuals of the time, which started to discuss the optimal layout of rooms and the functions they should serve. There was a growing emphasis on order, cleanliness, and separating the polite public spaces from the more functional or private ones. And the bedroom, while still potentially a place for receiving guests or housing servants overnight, was definitely drifting towards becoming more associated with the core family unit and personal activities like dressing and hygiene, as hygiene slowly became more of a thing. However, step outside those grand houses, and you'd find that for the vast majority of people across Britain and Europe, the nightly routine looked much the same as it had for centuries. Gathered together for warmth and security, sharing sleeping quarters with family, laborers, or lodgers. The Enlightenment might have brought new ideas about individual rights and reason, but the simple realities of economics, space, and survival meant that communal sleeping remained the dominant mode of nocturnal existence for the masses. The road to the solitary private bedroom was still very long, and most people hadn't even started walking down it yet. You were still likely snoozing shoulder to shoulder, maybe with a chamber pot nearby, and definitely not expecting quiet solitude. Now, just as those fancy folk were starting to ponder the possibility of having like a whole room just to themselves, perhaps even with a door that closed, history threw a massive wrench into the works. We're talking a shift so profound, so utterly transformative, it makes the move from hunter-gatherer to farmer look like switching from decaf to regular coffee. Enter the Industrial Revolution. Starting roughly in the late 18th century and really cranking up the gears in the 19th, this period saw factories sprout like mushrooms after rain, steam engines chug into existence, and people flock in unprecedented numbers from the countryside to newly booming industrial towns and cities. This wasn't just a gentle migration, it was a human tsunami. People left behind the familiar rhythms of agrarian life, where sleeping arrangements, while often communal, were usually among family or known farmhands, for the promise, often false, of steady work in the mills, mines, and factories. And where did all these people live? Well, housing simply couldn't keep up with the explosion in population density in these urban centers. Builders couldn't construct houses fast enough, and those they did build were often shoddily made, crammed together in narrow streets with little thought for sanitation or space. Imagine arriving in a smoky, noisy, bustling industrial city, having perhaps never seen anything larger than a market town before. You need somewhere to sleep, somewhere close to your back-breaking factory job. Affordable housing was virtually non-existent for the vast working-class majority. What was available was expensive, tiny, and usually already overflowing with people. This is where communal sleeping arrangements didn't just continue. They intensified to a degree that makes medieval shared beds look positively spacious and hygienic by comparison. The mainstream historical fact here is unavoidable and stark. The Industrial Revolution led to unprecedented levels of urban overcrowding, forcing the working class into incredibly cramped and unsanitary shared living and sleeping conditions, often housing multiple families or unrelated lodgers in single rooms or tiny houses. This wasn't a choice born of tradition or warmth, but of sheer economic necessity. You didn't share a bed for companionship. You shared it because you literally couldn't afford a sliver of floor space to yourself. Picture this, a single room, perhaps 10 feet by 12 feet, in a hastily built tenement or cellar dwelling. It might house a family of 6, plus 3 or 4 lodgers paying a few pennies for a spot to sleep. Beds were scarce commodities. If you were lucky, there might be 1 or 2 beds, probably shared by multiple people in shifts, particularly if the lodgers worked different factory hours. Remember the concept of hot bedding we touched upon earlier? This era saw it reach epidemic proportions. One person would get out of bed after a 12-hour shift, and another person, perhaps a complete stranger, working the opposite shift, would immediately get in before the sheets, if there were any, had even cooled down. The bed was quite literally hot from the previous occupant's body heat. If there weren't enough beds, people slept on the floor, on straw, rags, or simply the bare, often damp earth or floorboards. Whole families would huddle together for warmth, sometimes with lodgers crammed in alongside them. Personal space became an utterly meaningless concept. You were constantly in the presence of others, their breathing, their coughs, their smells, and oh, the smells. This brings us directly back to hygiene. While the wealthy in their emerging specialized rooms might have been slowly inching towards better personal cleanliness, for the vast majority living in these industrial slums, hygiene was an almost impossible dream. Sanitation infrastructure was either non-existent or woefully inadequate. Think overflowing cesspits in shared yards, no running water indoors. Water had to be fetched from often distant and contaminated pumps, and waste simply being thrown into the streets or open drains. Remember those chamber pots from earlier sections? They were still very much in use, often simply emptied into the street outside the door. Washing clothes was a major undertaking, washing oneself a rare luxury. Vermin, rats, lice, fleas, bedbugs were ubiquitous companions. Diseases like cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis ripped through these overcrowded, unsanitary communities like wildfire. Your sleeping space wasn't just cramped, it was a breeding ground for illness. The air would be thick with the smell of stale bodies, damp, refuse, and whatever industrial pollutants drifted in from nearby factories. Try getting a restful night's sleep when you're sharing a bed with 2 strangers, shivering from the cold, or sweating from shared body heat. Scratching at lice bites and breathing in air that's a cocktail of human and industrial waste, all while the sounds of the overcrowded room and the crazy street outside filtered through. Sleep was less about rest and more about temporary unconsciousness endured amidst discomfort and potential contagion. A quirky tidbit from this period that highlights the desperate need for space and the ingenuity, or perhaps just desperation, it spawned is the existence of purpose-built lodging houses designed for maximum human density. These places were often little more than large rooms crammed with rows of beds or bunks, rented out by the night or week. In some, you might find ropes where people paid a minimal fee to lean against a rope strung across the room and sleep standing or hunched over, presumably to avoid contact with the filthy floors or vermin-ridden beds. Imagine paying to sleep vertically. That's peak overcrowding desperation right there. It makes paying extra for legroom on a plane feel utterly reasonable by comparison. Historians still argue whether the appalling housing conditions of the Industrial Revolution were an inevitable byproduct of rapid, unregulated economic growth, or if they were actively exacerbated by the indifference or outright exploitation of landlords and factory owners who profited from cramming as many people as possible into minimal space. Was it simply chaos or calculated neglect? The reality is probably a bit of both, but the debate underscores the complex social dynamics at play beyond just the sheer numbers. The experience of sleep fundamentally changed for the working class during this period. It was no longer the relatively predictable, albeit still shared rhythm of rural life. It was dictated by the factory whistle and the demands of shift work. Families were often separated by work schedules, leading to fragmented sleep patterns and less time spent together. The concept of a family bed wasn't a warm, comforting embrace anymore. It was a potentially disease-ridden necessity crammed into a tiny space. Even for those who managed to secure a small, self-contained dwelling, the shared living arrangements continued in different forms. Subletting parts of rooms, taking in multiple lodgers, or multiple families sharing a small house were incredibly common strategies just to make rent. Privacy, as the upper classes were starting to imagine it, remained completely out of reach for the vast majority. Your life, day and night, was an open book to those you shared your cramped quarters with. The beds themselves, if you had one, were often basic wooden frames with straw mattresses, if anything. Comfort was a distant dream. They were simply elevated platforms to avoid the cold, damp floor, and perhaps a slight defense against ground-level vermin. Bedclothes were luxury items, often shared or non-existent. You might sleep in your work clothes or whatever rags you possessed simply because changing was too cold, too difficult in the cramped space, or you had nothing else to wear. This intense period of overcrowding and poor sanitation fundamentally shaped not only sleeping arrangements, but also public health initiatives later on. The sheer scale of the problem became undeniable as diseases spread indiscriminately, eventually forcing authorities to consider basic sanitation, housing standards, and public health measures. Although progress was incredibly slow and hard-fought, the dark, airless, overcrowded bedrooms, or lack thereof, of the industrial era were a stark reminder that for most people, comfort and privacy were still very distant luxuries. You were packed in tight, breathing the same stale air, and sharing your space, your warmth, and your germs with whoever else happened to be crammed into that room with you. It was a far cry from the curtained luxury of the elite or the relatively healthier, albeit basic, shared sleep of the rural past. It was survival sleep, plain and simple. So while the factory floors were humming and the tenements were bursting at the seams with human sardines and hotbeds, something quieter but equally significant was happening a few streets over in slightly better neighborhoods. We're leaving the absolute grinding poverty for a moment, not because it disappeared, far from it, but because the next major evolution in sleeping arrangements came not from the top of society, they were already sorted mostly, or the bottom, they were still stuck in survival mode, but from the burgeoning middle. Think about this new class. They weren't dukes or earls with country estates and multiple townhouses, each boasting dozens of rooms. But they weren't farm laborers or factory operatives sleeping 10 to a room either. These were the merchants who sold goods, the lawyers who drew up contracts, the doctors who treated the sick, if they could pay, the managers who ran the factories, the clerks who kept the books, the shopkeepers, the engineers. People with education, skills, and critically, some disposable income. Enough maybe to rent or even buy a house that wasn't just one or two multi-purpose rooms. This rising middle class had aspirations. They looked up at the gentry and aristocracy and thought, that looks nice, all that space, all that privacy. They wanted to signal their success, their respectability, their distance from the chaotic, unwashed masses of the working poor. And one of the key ways to do that, to literally build a distinction, was in the design and function of their homes. The home became a stage for respectability and a sanctuary from the increasingly harsh and public world outside. This is where the idea of specialized rooms really took hold for a broader segment of the population. Before, even in many wealthier homes, rooms might serve multiple purposes throughout the day and night. But the 19th century middle class started dividing up space according to activity. There was the parlor, just for receiving guests and displaying your nice things. There was the dining room, solely for eating. There was a kitchen, perhaps, separated from the main house to keep the smells and heat away. And then, tucked away upstairs, were the rooms meant just for sleeping. The birth of the dedicated private bedroom as an achievable ideal for more than just the elite. The drive for the private bedroom was multifaceted. Firstly, there was privacy in the modern sense, the desire to retreat from the public areas of the house, to have a space where you weren't always on display, where you could be truly off duty. If you could afford a servant or two, a common marker of middle-class status, having separate bedrooms meant you weren't sleeping alongside someone who worked for you, maintaining a physical and social boundary. Secondly, and perhaps even more strongly in the Victorian era, there was the push for respectability and morality. Sharing beds, particularly with non-family members or members of the opposite sex outside of marriage, was increasingly frowned upon as improper. The close communal sleeping of the poor was viewed not just as unfortunate, but as potentially morally corrupting. The middle class wanted to distance themselves from this image entirely. Separate bedrooms, and ideally separate beds within those rooms, became a symbol of moral uprightness and familial propriety. Parents didn't want to share a bed with older children anymore. Siblings of different sexes needed separate rooms if at all possible. And the idea of taking in a non-related lodger and sharing sleeping space with them, a necessity for the working class, was practically unthinkable for the respectable middle. And finally, there was a developing, albeit still rudimentary, understanding of hygiene and health. While they didn't have germ theory as we know it, there was a growing sense that fresh air was good, that stale, overcrowded spaces could breed illness. A separate bedroom, potentially with a window that opened, a luxury in many working-class dwellings, felt healthier than sleeping in a cluttered, multi-purpose room on the ground floor that might also serve as a workshop or living area during the day. The air upstairs was often considered cleaner, further associating the bedroom with purity and health. So, the mainstream historical fact crystallizing here is this. The rise of the middle class in the 19th century was a key driver in the architectural shift towards homes with dedicated, separate bedrooms, establishing the concept of the private sleeping space as a desirable norm and a symbol of social status, privacy, and respectability. This fundamentally changed the domestic landscape for a significant portion of the population. Architects and builders responded to this demand. Instead of building large, open houses like the gentry or tiny one- or two-room cottages like the laborers, they designed houses with multiple, smaller rooms over 2 or 3 stories. Think of the classic Victorian terrace house or semi-detached villa. They were designed with distinct ground floor reception rooms and then a series of bedrooms upstairs. The layout itself dictated a new way of living and sleeping, partitioning the house into public and semi-public downstairs and private upstairs zones. This physical separation was a powerful social statement. Within these new bedrooms, the sleeping arrangements also began to change. While married couples typically continued to share a double bed, though even that saw evolving styles, the practice of multiple siblings of the same sex sharing a single bed, while still common, started to decline if the family could afford more space. 2 single beds in a room became an option, or children moved into their own small rooms as they got older. The enormous, often crowded beds of earlier periods gave way to beds sized for 1 or 2 specific, related individuals. The quirky tidbit here relates to the furniture that started filling these new dedicated bedrooms, with sleep confined to one room, and that room now a symbol of respectability. A whole industry of bedroom furniture developed. Before, furniture was often multi-purpose or kept in main living areas. Now you needed a bed specifically designed for sleeping, a wardrobe, because clothes weren't just kept in chests anymore, a dressing table, a washstand for your morning ablutions, hopefully with fresh water hauled up from downstairs, and perhaps a bedside cabinet. These items weren't just functional, they were chosen to reflect taste and status. A matching bedroom set became a desirable thing, a complete ensemble dedicated solely to the rituals of rest and personal preparation. It's a far cry from throwing a mattress on the floor in a communal living space. Imagine setting up your fancy new wardrobe in your designated sleep spot. Look, I have enough clothes and enough space to put them away neatly in the room where I only sleep. Peak bourgeois aspiration right there. Historians still argue whether the intense focus on separating sleeping spaces and creating private bedrooms was a genuine response to felt needs for privacy and changing moral standards, or if it was primarily a form of social signaling, a way for the aspirational middle class to distinguish themselves from the working class whose lives and homes remain crowded and public. Was it driven by comfort and conscience, or simply by class consciousness? The truth, as always, is probably a complex blend, but the debate highlights how deeply intertwined social status and domestic arrangements became during this period. For the working class, stuck in overcrowded tenements, this middle-class revolution in housing remained a distant dream. They continued to share beds, floors, and rooms out of necessity. The private bedroom wasn't a concept relevant to their lives. They were still dealing with anywhere you can fit without getting trampled. This growing divergence in living and sleeping conditions between the classes was a defining feature of the 19th century, solidifying the idea that how and where you slept was intimately linked to your place in society. Your home wasn't just shelter, it was a map of the social hierarchy, and the number of private bedrooms you possessed, or didn't, was a key indicator. Even the act of going to bed changed. For the middle class, it became a more private, ritualized process. You retreated upstairs, closed a door, another novelty for many, maybe washed up at your washstand, changed into night clothes, another item now seen as necessary for respectability and warmth, and got into your bed. It was a conscious withdrawal from the shared life of the household into a personal space. This was a massive psychological shift from the constant, unavoidable presence of others in a shared sleeping space. Think about the mental impact. In a shared communal space, sleep is often light, easily disturbed by others' movements, sounds, and smells. There's a constant low level of awareness of others. In a private bedroom, even if sharing with a spouse, there's a potential for deeper rest, a greater sense of security and solitude. You could finally perhaps snore without instant public shaming, or at least without disturbing 6 unrelated people. It offered a chance to truly unwind in a way that was impossible when packed elbow to ribcage with strangers. The move to private bedrooms wasn't instantaneous or absolute, even for the middle class. Family size and finances still dictated much. Children often shared rooms and sometimes even beds, particularly when young. But the ideal was set: a separate room for sleeping, ideally separate rooms for different family members as they grew older. This ideal permeated society, influencing housing design and expectations right up to the present day. We are still, in many ways, living with the architectural and social legacy of the 19th century middle class's desire for a room of one's own, specifically for sleep. It's thanks to them, in large part, that we automatically assume a house should have bedrooms as distinct entities, rather than just rooms where people might happen to sleep. They elevated sleep space from a practical necessity to a symbol of aspiration and privacy. So while the bricks and mortar were being laid to create those distinct upstairs bedrooms we talked about, marking a physical separation driven by social aspiration and a nascent sense of privacy, there was another powerful and often quite anxious force at play, shaping sleeping habits: the pervasive fear of illness and a rapidly evolving, often confused, understanding of health. We've moved from the pragmatic needs of the past and the social climbing of the new middle class to the anxieties bubbling beneath the surface of the Victorian age. This era, the 19th century, was a time of paradox, incredible technological progress, burgeoning wealth for some, but also rampant disease in overcrowded cities, shocking levels of pollution, and a constant underlying fear of epidemics sweeping through the population. Cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, these weren't abstract threats. They were devastating realities that could strike anyone, though they hit the poor, living in the worst conditions, the hardest. This constant threat focused minds intensely on health, but the dominant scientific theories weren't quite caught up with the reality of microbial life. The prevailing theory for much of the century, and one that profoundly influenced ideas about living spaces and sleep, was the miasma theory. Forget tiny, invisible bugs infecting you. This theory suggested that diseases were caused by bad air, noxious vapors, putrid smells, gases rising from decaying organic matter, sewers, garbage, stagnant water. The air itself, particularly in crowded, poorly ventilated areas, was thought to be literally poisonous, carrying disease like a fog. Now think about shared sleeping spaces through the lens of miasma. A room packed with multiple bodies, perhaps poorly ventilated, maybe with chamber pots tucked under beds, where air is breathed and rebreathed. This was, by definition, a breeding ground for bad air. It smelled, didn't it? The Victorians were incredibly sensitive to smells, linking them directly to health risks. The scent of too many unwashed bodies, stale breath, sweat, sickness. This wasn't just unpleasant, it was considered deadly. So, shared beds, shared rooms, the communal sleeping we've seen throughout history suddenly looked not just poor or immoral, but downright dangerous. If bad air caused disease, then being crammed together in a small, stuffy space with others, breathing their exhalations all night, was like signing up for a one-way ticket to the local cemetery. This fear wasn't entirely unfounded. Crowded, unsanitary conditions did spread disease rapidly, but the mechanism was microbial, not mystical vapors. Still, the miasma theory provided a compelling, if incorrect, explanation that fueled intense anxiety about shared sleep. This health anxiety became a powerful driver for change, supplementing the desires for privacy and respectability. Doctors, reformers, and public health advocates, operating under the miasma theory, began to preach the gospel of ventilation and fresh air. Open windows were a must, even in the depths of winter. Brrr. Houses needed better airflow, and crucially, sleeping spaces needed to be less crowded. The quirky tidbit that emerges here relates to the truly earnest, sometimes bizarre advice given for achieving healthy sleep environments. Beyond just opening windows, there were specific instructions about bedroom furniture and layout. Bed sheets and mattresses needed to be regularly aired out, literally hung out the window or brought outside, to purify them of noxious effluvia given off by the body during sleep. Some reformers advocated for iron bedsteads over wooden ones, as they were seen as less likely to absorb and retain these dangerous vapors. There was even advice on the best position for your bed in the room relative to the window and door to maximize airflow. Imagine your doctor telling you your chronic cough was because your bed wasn't positioned correctly for optimal miasma dispersal. It sounds hilarious now, but it was deadly serious advice then. The sheer effort people were advised to undertake just to clean their sleeping air, it makes worrying about dust mites seem positively low maintenance. Sorry, honey, can't kiss you goodnight. Gotta go beat the miasma out of the mattress. This leads us to a key mainstream historical fact. The Victorian era saw the birth and growth of significant public health movements, heavily influenced by miasma theory initially, but nonetheless driving crucial reforms in sanitation, housing, and ventilation. Figures like Edwin Chadwick, though flawed, campaigned tirelessly for better drains, clean water, and improved housing standards, arguing that these were essential to combat disease. While germ theory eventually superseded miasma, the focus on clean environments, ventilation, and reducing overcrowding persisted and became central to modern public health. The belief that crowded, poorly ventilated homes were unhealthy wasn't wrong. The why was just slightly off. These health anxieties reinforced the middle-class push for separate bedrooms. Not only was it more respectable and private, but it was also healthier. A room with 1 or 2 people breathing the air was perceived as infinitely safer than a room with 6, 8, or 10. Parents worried about children sharing beds and potentially passing on coughs or fevers. Again, right concern, wrong mechanism. Separate beds within a room, or entirely separate rooms, became linked in the public consciousness with good health practices. It was a way to protect your family from the invisible, deadly fumes supposedly circulating in close quarters. The design of houses started to reflect this. Bedrooms were often placed upstairs, away from the street level where pollution might be worse. They were given windows that could open, and sometimes even specific ventilation shafts or gratings built into the walls near the ceiling to encourage airflow, often called ventilating bricks. Fireplaces, too, served a dual purpose of heating and providing ventilation, drawing stale air up the chimney. These architectural features weren't just about comfort, they were considered vital health interventions. Building a house with ample, well-ventilated bedrooms wasn't just a luxury, it was seen as building a defense against disease. This blend of health fears, driven by miasma, and moral anxieties, linking dirt and disease to moral failing, created a powerful imperative for separating bodies at night. The image of the working class crammed into tenements, sharing beds out of necessity, was not only seen as a sign of their poverty, but also as inherently unhealthy and morally suspect. Their living conditions were pathologized, used as evidence of their inferiority. The middle class, with their separate, airy bedrooms, could congratulate themselves on their superior health and their superior morality. It was a neat package of justification for social stratification. Historians still argue whether the emphasis on bad air and hygiene in Victorian homes was a primary driver for the move to separate bedrooms, or if it was a secondary justification that conveniently supported the pre-existing desires for privacy, respectability, and social distinction that we discussed in the previous section. Was it a genuine, if scientifically misguided, concern for well-being that enabled the trend towards separation? Or was it an anxious echo chamber amplifying a convenient health narrative to support a social shift already underway? Did people truly believe miasma was the main threat and redesign their lives accordingly? Or was it just another reason, alongside wanting to show off their wealth and moral rectitude, to get the kids into their own rooms? This period also saw an increasing emphasis on sleep as a restorative process necessary for health, not just a period of unconsciousness. Books and articles were written advising people on how much sleep they needed and the conditions required for proper sleep. And those conditions invariably involve fresh air and freedom from disturbance, much harder to achieve when you're sharing a bed with multiple people or sleeping in a noisy, crowded room that serves multiple functions. The ideal of undisturbed private sleep for health became another plank in the platform advocating for individual bedrooms. Think about the sensory experience again. Stepping into a middle-class Victorian bedroom, even a small one, would likely feel different from the communal sleeping spaces of earlier times or the working-class tenements. There might be lace curtains diffusing the light, wallpaper on the walls, a proper bed frame off the floor, perhaps even a rug. Crucially, there might be a window you could open, letting in, well, hopefully fresher air than downstairs, though in industrial cities, that was a relative concept. The feeling of space, even a little dedicated space, was linked to the feeling of cleanliness and health. You weren't just escaping observation, you were escaping potential contamination. The fear of contagion within the home, amplified by the miasma theory, made sharing beds with anyone exhibiting signs of illness practically taboo for those who could afford to avoid it. This further solidified the idea of the bed as a personal, even sacred space, ideally shared only with a healthy spouse. The casual sharing of beds, common in previous centuries, became increasingly associated with poverty and sickness, reinforcing its undesirability for the aspiring classes. Even children's sleeping arrangements were pathologized through this lens. Sharing a bed with siblings was fine, perhaps, but better if they were the same sex and didn't cough too much. Sharing a bed with a parent, especially as they got older, became less common in the middle class, partly for reasons of privacy and morality, but also due to vague health concerns about co-sleeping and bad air. Everyone needed their own airspace, even within the family unit. This era, driven by a mix of genuine anxiety about disease and a scientifically limited understanding of its causes, cemented the idea that private, well-ventilated sleeping spaces were essential for health. It added a powerful, almost medical justification to the social and moral arguments for the separate bedroom. While we now understand germs, not just bad smells, are the culprits, the legacy of the Victorian fixation on fresh air and avoiding overcrowded, stuffy spaces lives on in our expectations of what a healthy home, and specifically a healthy bedroom, should be like. They might have been a bit off on the why, but they were definitely onto something about the importance of personal space and ventilation for well-being, even if it took a rather dramatic miasma-fueled detour to get there. It's thanks to their anxieties in part that we recoil at the thought of sleeping cheek by jowl with strangers, feeling instinctively that it's, well, unhealthy and maybe a bit smelly. So if the Victorians were battling the invisible, and thankfully non-existent, at least in that form, threat of bad air wafting disease into their shared sleeping spaces, their descendants, moving into the late 19th and early 20th centuries, were about to confront a real invisible enemy: microbes. The transition from the miasma theory to the germ theory of disease wasn't immediate or universally accepted overnight. Scientific paradigms rarely are. But as figures like Pasteur, Koch, and Lister conducted their groundbreaking work, the evidence became undeniable. Diseases weren't caused by smells. They were caused by tiny living organisms you couldn't see without a microscope. This shift in understanding profoundly altered the landscape of health anxieties and consequently the perception of shared living and sleeping spaces. If disease was spread by direct contact with these microscopic invaders, or through vectors like contaminated water, food, or surfaces, then proximity to other people, especially in close quarters, took on a terrifying new dimension. Miasma was vague and atmospheric. Germs were precise and contagious. Breathing the same air was one thing. Breathing in someone else's expelled germs, or coming into contact with surfaces that they had touched, felt much more direct and personal. Think about it: shared beds. Under the miasma theory, the risk was the collective bad air building up. Under germ theory, the risk was sharing bodily fluids, even just sweat or saliva on a pillow, breathing in coughs and sneezes directly, and touching bedding and surfaces that harbored invisible armies of bacteria and viruses. A shared bed wasn't just stuffy, it was a potential petri dish of human illness. Your bedmate wasn't just contributing to the bad air, they were a walking, sleeping source of potential contagion. This new microbial understanding elevated personal hygiene from a matter of comfort and respectability to a matter of life and death. Suddenly, washing hands wasn't just about looking clean, it was about removing potentially deadly germs. Laundry wasn't just about fresh scents, it was about sterilizing fabrics that could harbor pathogens. And shared items, especially those in intimate contact with bodies like bedding, became objects of intense scrutiny and anxiety. The concept of cleanliness shifted. It wasn't just the absence of visible dirt or foul smells, it was the absence of germs. This led to a new wave of household products aimed at disinfection. Carbolic acid, Lysol, and other potent cleaners became marketed not just for smell, but for their germ-killing power. The bathroom, often a separate, dedicated space developed during the Victorian era, became a central battleground in the war against germs, equipped with porcelain fixtures deemed easier to clean and sanitize. And the bedroom? It needed to become a sanctuary of microbial purity. While fresh air was still considered important, it helped disperse airborne particles. Even if the Victorians didn't know that's why, the focus shifted to surfaces, bedding, and direct person-to-person contact. This provided a powerful new justification, if one were needed, for the separate bed and ideally the separate bedroom. Why share a bed and risk inhaling someone else's cold germs, flu viruses, or worse, when you could have your own personal, hygienically controlled sleep zone? The rise of tuberculosis, often called the White Plague, which was known to be spread through airborne droplets and close contact, fueled immense fear and further underscored the perceived dangers of crowded, poorly ventilated spaces in intimate proximity like shared beds. Sanatoriums for TB patients emphasized fresh air and separation, lessons that filtered back into civilian life and reinforced the ideal of the private, airy, and separate sleeping space. This fear wasn't just about serious diseases, it was about everyday ailments too. A shared bed meant sharing sniffles, coughs, and the general unwellness of your partner or sibling. The perceived benefits of having your own bed for health reasons became a potent argument, supplementing the social arguments about privacy and respectability that were already firmly established. A mainstream historical fact emerging from this era is the widespread adoption of the twin bed in married couples' bedrooms, particularly in North America during the early 20th century. This wasn't just a design fad, it was explicitly marketed in part on health grounds. Advertisements and advice manuals of the time promoted twin beds as a way for spouses to avoid disturbing each other, a privacy aspect, but also crucially, to prevent the transmission of germs and ensure each person breathed their own fresh air, free from their partner's exhalations and potential contagions. The idea of the marital bed as a single shared space began to look a bit unsanitary, potentially detrimental to health. Think about the sheer volume of marketing around cleanliness and health that exploded in the early 20th century. Soap, toothpaste, disinfectants, laundry detergent, all framed around killing germs and protecting your family. This cultural obsession seeped into every corner of life, including the most intimate space, the bed. Having separate beds was presented not just as modern or convenient, but as responsible, hygienic, and healthy. Sleep alone for health became a quiet mantra. The quirky or fringe tidbit here relates to some of the more extreme anxieties and solutions proposed during this period of burgeoning germ awareness. There were serious discussions and even attempts to design bedding that would somehow filter the air around the sleeper or create individual microclimates free of exhaled breath. People became obsessive about airing out mattresses and blankets, not just to remove effluvia, the old miasma idea, but to kill or remove germs. Some advised sleeping with the windows wide open, even in freezing temperatures, believing the cold, clean air would kill any lingering germs. Sleeping porches became popular additions to houses, allowing people to literally sleep outdoors year-round, convinced it was the pinnacle of healthy, germ-free sleep. Imagine bundling up in 10 blankets just to sleep outside in January, all for the sake of fighting invisible enemies. Makes you appreciate central heating and a closed window, doesn't it? This intense focus on cleanliness and hygiene also fed back into class distinctions. While the miasma theory linked dirt and disease to moral failing, germ theory linked them to ignorance and lack of proper practice. The poor, living in crowded conditions with limited access to clean water and sanitation, were again pathologized. Their shared living spaces and necessity for sharing beds weren't just unfortunate, they were seen as breeding grounds for disease that threatened the health of the entire community. The ability to afford a clean, separate bedroom with its own bed and clean linens became a powerful marker of not just wealth, but also of health consciousness and responsibility. Historians still argue whether the widespread acceptance of germ theory and the accompanying health anxieties were the decisive factor in making separate bedrooms and beds the norm, or if these health arguments merely provided a convenient, science-backed justification for a trend already driven by desires for privacy, individuality, and upward mobility. Did people actually switch to twin beds primarily because they feared germs? Or was it more about adopting the latest fashionable practice that also happened to come with a handy health rationale? It's tough to untangle the genuine fear of illness from the desire to appear modern, respectable, and health conscious. The early 20th century saw the bedroom solidify its identity as a private retreat, a place of personal hygiene and health restoration. The idea of sleeping communally, even just sharing a bed with a non-spouse family member or guest, began to feel increasingly alien and undesirable to the middle and upper classes. The bed itself became a highly personal item, ideally used by only one or at most two people, a married couple. This contrasts starkly with periods when beds were seen more as communal furniture, like a large sofa you might share with whoever happened to be around when it was time to sleep. The design of bedrooms continued to evolve, emphasizing light, air, and surfaces that were easy to clean. Hardwood floors or linoleum replaced carpets in some areas, deemed more hygienic. Walls were painted or covered in washable wallpaper. Furniture became simpler, less ornate, reducing places for dust and potential germs to hide. The aesthetic of cleanliness became intertwined with the aesthetic of the modern bedroom. Even the language use changed. You didn't just go to bed, you retired to your room. It was a withdrawal from the shared spaces of the house into a personal, controlled environment. This privacy wasn't just social or moral anymore. It was actively framed as a way to protect your health and ensure restorative sleep, free from the disturbances and potential microbial threats posed by others. The transition to germ theory provided the final nail in the coffin for widespread shared sleeping practices in Western cultures, at least for those who could afford the alternative. While the earlier push was for privacy and respectability, the new understanding of disease added a powerful visceral fear. Sharing a bed wasn't just awkward or improper, it was dangerous. It was a risk to your health. This era cemented the ideal that persists today: the bedroom as a private, individual space dedicated solely to sleep and personal activities, and the bed as a personal item, ideally not shared lightly. The legacy of Victorian anxieties about bad air, combined with the early 20th century fears of invisible germs, created a powerful cultural imperative for spatial and physical separation at night. You weren't just buying privacy or status when you got your own bed. You were buying peace of mind, believing you were protecting yourself from the myriad tiny threats that science had suddenly revealed were all around you, especially in close contact with others. It was a journey from fearing the air you shared to fearing the very breath and touch of your bedmates. And while our understanding of disease transmission has become more nuanced since the initial germ panic, the instinct for private, clean sleeping spaces, born out of these anxieties, remains firmly embedded in our culture. So fresh off the heels of fighting imaginary bad smells, and then very real but invisible, tiny invaders, the early 20th century homeowner, especially those with a little disposable income, began to solidify a new ideal for the bedroom. It wasn't just about avoiding miasma or germs anymore. It was about creating a space that reflected a burgeoning sense of individualism, privacy, and a very specific idea of health and well-being. The architectural landscape started to change, moving away from the multi-purpose, often interconnected rooms of earlier periods towards houses with clearly defined functions. The hall became a separate entry point, the parlor for receiving guests, the dining room for eating, the kitchen for cooking, and crucially, bedrooms specifically and solely for sleeping and dressing. This wasn't a sudden revolution, but a gradual evolution that accelerated as more families entered the middle class and could afford larger homes with more rooms. In earlier centuries, adding rooms might mean expanding the main living area or adding a dedicated workspace or a larger kitchen. Now it meant adding bedrooms. The number of bedrooms became a key selling point for a house, a direct indicator of how many people could potentially sleep separately, comfortably, and privately. A four-bedroom house wasn't just bigger than a two-bedroom house. It represented a higher standard of living, a place where children could have their own rooms, and where parents could retreat to their own sanctuary. Think about the psychological shift. You weren't just sharing a bed because that's what everyone did or because you needed the body heat. You were choosing to have your own space. Your bedroom became a reflection of you, a place where you could escape the shared domestic sphere. It was where you kept your most personal belongings, where you could read, think, or simply be without the constant presence of others. This idea of the bedroom as a personal retreat, separate from the rest of the family or household, was a relatively new concept for the majority of the population. The furniture within these bedrooms also evolved. Beds, now intended for one or maybe two specific people, became more standardized. Dressers, wardrobes, and later closets, which weren't standard in older homes, became essential fixtures, allowing you to store your personal clothing and items within the privacy of your room. The bedroom wasn't just where you slept, it was where you dressed, where you kept your personal possessions, enhancing its role as a private domain. It was like finally getting your own locker at school, but for your entire life. The push for hygiene, fueled by germ theory, also heavily influenced bedroom design and use. As mentioned before, twin beds became popular for couples, explicitly marketed for health. Bedroom windows were often large and designed to be opened easily to let in fresh air. Still seen as vital for health, both for dispersing lingering miasma, a belief that died hard, and for airing out potential germs. Sunlight was also believed to be a disinfectant, so rooms were oriented to maximize light. Mattresses and bedding were aired frequently, ideally outdoors, to purify them. You were not just making your bed, you were performing a ritual of hygienic maintenance. Imagine dragging your mattress out onto the balcony every sunny day, a level of dedication to freshness we rarely see now, thankfully. We just buy Febreze. This move towards separate bedrooms and individual beds was strongly tied to upward social mobility. The working classes, still living in smaller homes or crowded tenements, often had no choice but to continue shared sleeping arrangements, whether it was multiple family members in one room or boarders sharing beds to make ends meet. This created a visible distinction. The ability to provide a separate bedroom for each child, or at least separate beds, became a tangible marker of having made it, of offering your family a healthier, more respectable life. It wasn't just comfort, it was status. The mainstream historical fact here is the significant increase in average house size and the corresponding rise in the number of dedicated bedrooms in middle-class homes built throughout the 20th century, particularly in North America and Western Europe. While a pre-industrial home might have had 2 or 3 rooms serving multiple purposes for a large family, a typical mid-20th century suburban house would boast 3 or 4 dedicated bedrooms, even for a smaller family. This architectural shift fundamentally changed how people lived and slept. The very blueprint of the home began to bake in the expectation of private, individual sleeping spaces. It became the default rather than the exception. The concept of children's bedrooms is a key part of this story. In earlier times, children would sleep with parents, siblings, or other household members out of necessity. But the 20th century saw the rise of the idea that children, too, needed their own space for proper development, health, and discipline. A child having their own bedroom wasn't just a luxury, it was framed as beneficial for their character, promoting independence and privacy from a young age. This is a significant departure from seeing children simply as miniature adults who fit wherever there was space. My quirky or fringe tidbit relates to some child-rearing guides from the early to mid-20th century that strongly recommended separate bedrooms for siblings, especially boys and girls as they got older, not just for modesty, though that was part of it, but explicitly to prevent them from disrupting each other's sleep and potentially transmitting illnesses. Some even suggested measures like sleeping with doors open to ensure parental oversight, creating a strange mix of enforced privacy and open access. It's a bit contradictory. Here's your private room, but leave the door open so I can check on you. It probably felt less like a sanctuary and more like a slightly roomier cage. The rise of new materials and manufacturing processes also played a role. Mass-produced mattresses, bed frames, and bedding became more affordable and widely available. This made it easier for families to equip multiple bedrooms with individual beds. The iron or steel bed frame, which became popular in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was easier to keep clean than older wooden frames, tying back into the hygiene concerns. Suddenly, having multiple beds wasn't an insurmountable financial burden for the growing middle class. Historians still argue whether the primary driver for the widespread adoption of the private bedroom and individual bed was economic prosperity, simply allowing for more space and furniture, or if it was a deeper cultural shift towards valuing individualism, privacy, and health that propelled the economic changes in architectural trends. Did we build bigger houses because we wanted private bedrooms? Or did we start wanting private bedrooms because we could finally afford bigger houses? It's a classic chicken and egg scenario in social history, and the answer is likely a complex interplay of factors. The bedroom became a quiet battleground for domestic technology and convenience. Nightstands appeared, holding lamps, as electric lighting became common. Books and personal items. Alarm clocks became standard, regulating the transition from sleep in the private space back into the public world. The room was increasingly furnished for comfort and personal use, not just for the utilitarian act of sleeping. This era cemented the idea that sleeping alone, or just with your spouse, in your own room was the normal, desirable state. Shared beds among non-spouses became increasingly associated with poverty, necessity, or specific circumstances like travel, no longer a casual or common practice. The concept of personal space extended strongly into the night. You were expected to have your own bed, ideally your own room, and anyone who didn't was often seen as less fortunate or living in substandard conditions. The very idea of a sleepover, where children might temporarily share beds or floor space, became a distinct, sometimes slightly daring, event precisely because it deviated from the norm of individual sleeping spaces. It was a temporary return to a practice that had been the everyday reality for most people throughout history, now framed as a special occasion of shared childhood adventure. This 20th century push for bedroom privacy wasn't without its critics or counter-movements, which we'll touch on later, but it undeniably became the dominant ideal in Western culture. It was reinforced by everything from architecture magazines showing floor plans with multiple bedrooms, to furniture catalogs selling bedroom suites, to health advice columns extolling the virtues of undisturbed individual sleep. The legacy of the communal bed, once the norm, faded into a historical curiosity for most, replaced by the quiet sanctity of the private bedroom, a space carved out for the individual in the modern home. It's where you retreated, closed the door, and hopefully found peace and healthy rest, free from the germs and the gaze of others. This shift wasn't just about bricks and mortar, or even just about fighting off those invisible germy enemies you now worried about thanks to science. No, the move towards separate bedrooms and individual beds started to profoundly reshape the very fabric of family life, changing how you interacted, how you grew up, and even how you saw yourself within the home. Think about it. For centuries, sleeping together, often in the same room as multiple family members or even strangers, meant a constant, unavoidable level of interaction. Arguments were settled, or festered, within earshot, secrets were harder to keep, and the rhythms of everyone's day and night were intertwined. It was like a perpetual involuntary group chat that you couldn't mute. With the rise of the private bedroom, especially for children as well as adults, you started to get away from that constant proximity. The home wasn't just a shared space anymore. It became a collection of personal zones linked by common areas like the living room or dining room. This newfound separation, while offering obvious benefits like privacy and reduced conflict over bedtime habits, no more elbowing your snoring sibling, also subtly altered the flow of communication and connection within the family unit. Impromptu late-night chats or comforting a sibling after a bad dream might become less common simply because there was a door and often a hallway between you. It wasn't necessarily bad, just different. It felt like upgrading from a studio apartment with roommates to a house where everyone had their own suite. Less noise, more space, maybe a touch, less spontaneity. For children, having their own bedroom became a huge marker in their development and sense of self. It wasn't just a place to sleep, it was their kingdom, their sanctuary, a space where they could express their personality through posters on the wall, carefully selected, of course, by you, the parent, initially, arrange their toys, and simply be away from the constant gaze of adults or siblings. This fostered a sense of independence and personal space that was largely unheard of for previous generations of children who often shared beds or rooms well into their teens, or even beyond. The transition from sleeping in the parents' room or with multiple siblings to getting your own room was a rite of passage, a tangible sign of growing up and being recognized as an individual with needs beyond mere physical shelter. But like most big shifts, this had two sides. While the privacy could be a blessing, offering a place for quiet study or personal reflection, it could also contribute to a sense of isolation. Family members might retreat to their rooms after dinner rather than gathering in a common area. The shared storytelling, games, or just quiet coexistence that happened naturally when everyone was packed into fewer rooms diminished. It required more intentional effort to connect as a family when everyone had their own private hideaway. You had to actively choose to spend time together rather than it being the default state of existence after dark. It's a bit like the difference between bumping into your colleagues all day in an open plan office versus having to schedule a meeting when everyone has their own soundproof booth. For married couples, the impact was also significant. We talked about the rise of twin beds driven by hygiene concerns. While proponents framed this as modern and healthy, allowing for undisturbed sleep and preventing the transmission of those dreaded germs. Remember our focus on invisible threats? It also introduced a physical separation into the most intimate space of the home. Critics and even some cultural commentators at the time worried, or sometimes joked, that twin beds symbolized a growing emotional distance between spouses, a move away from the shared warmth and physical closeness that the traditional shared bed represented. Was this new sleeping arrangement a sign of a healthier, more rational partnership, or a chilly harbinger of marital aloofness? It sparked plenty of conversation and probably a few awkward furniture shopping trips. Yes, salesperson, we're blissfully in love, but we definitely need these two separate beds. For health reasons, you see. The mainstream historical fact here is the increasing focus in 20th century psychology and popular advice literature on the importance of privacy and personal space for individual well-being and healthy development, particularly for children. Experts, writers, and even women's magazines began advocating for separate bedrooms and spaces within the home as essential for fostering independence, individuality, and emotional stability. This wasn't just an architectural trend driven by wealth. It was reinforced by a burgeoning understanding of human psychology and a belief that personal boundaries, starting within the home, were crucial for healthy individuals and thus a healthy society. It shifted the conversation from purely practical needs, warmth, shelter, fitting everyone in, to psychological ones. This era also solidified the bedroom as a space of personal retreat, a place where you weren't expected to perform a social role. The living room was for entertaining, the dining room for formal meals, but the bedroom was yours. It became associated with relaxation, intimacy for couples, and personal routines like dressing and getting ready for the day or winding down at night. This is where you kept your diary, if you were the type, read your private letters, or simply sat in quiet contemplation. The door was a literal and metaphorical boundary, protecting this personal realm from the demands and performances of the public or even family sphere. It was like getting your own private booth at a restaurant after eating at a communal mess hall your whole life. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this period relates to etiquette guides. As the concept of the private bedroom took hold, advice literature started appearing on the proper way to interact with these new personal spaces. This included detailed instructions on knocking before entering someone's room, even a child's, and respecting the closed door as a signal that the occupant desired privacy. For previous generations, where doors were often non-existent or left open in communal sleeping areas, this level of formal boundary setting within the family was novel. Imagine needing a manual to tell you not to just barge into your teenager's room, though arguably some parents still haven't read that manual. The shift also deepened class distinctions in a very visible way. While the middle and upper classes increasingly adopted the ideal of the multi-bedroom house with individual sleeping spaces, the working classes and the poor often continued to live in cramped conditions where shared sleeping arrangements were still a necessity. Sleeping alone or just with a spouse in a dedicated room became a powerful status symbol, a tangible representation of economic success and a respectable, modern way of life. It wasn't just about comfort. It was about demonstrating that you could afford to provide your family with privacy and the perceived health benefits that came with it. The number of bedrooms a house had became a key indicator of its desirability and the social standing of its inhabitants. It was the original flex. Oh yes, little Tarquin has his own room, naturally. Historians and sociologists still argue whether this widespread move towards private bedrooms and individual spaces within the home was primarily a cause or an effect of broader societal shifts towards individualism in Western culture. Did the architecture of the private home encourage people to become more individualistic and less communally oriented? Or did a pre-existing cultural lean towards individualism manifest itself in the desire for separate spaces? It's a fascinating debate about how physical environments shape social norms versus how social norms shape physical environments. Was the house changing us, or were we changing the house? It's probably a bit of both, tangled up like old sheets. The concept of the master bedroom also emerged during this period, solidifying the idea that the parental bedroom was the primary, largest, and most private suite in the house, distinct from children's rooms or guest rooms. It reinforced the hierarchical structure of the family within the physical space of the home. This wasn't just a room, it was the command center, the adult retreat, the place where decisions might be quietly discussed after the rest of the household was asleep. The cultural impact trickled down into even seemingly minor things. Bedtime stories, once perhaps told around a fire in a shared room, might now be read one-on-one in a child's individual bedroom. Family prayers might still gather everyone, but the return to individual rooms afterwards emphasized the separation. Even the concept of personal hygiene routines shifted. Washing and dressing became activities performed in the privacy of one's own room, often with adjacent bathrooms becoming more common, further segmenting the home and reinforcing personal boundaries. This emphasis on private space extended beyond the bedroom itself. Hallways became more defined, doors more numerous, and the flow of movement through the house became more segmented. You no longer simply walk through one room to get to another. You used hallways to navigate between distinct functional zones. This architectural trend paralleled the social trend towards greater personal privacy and reduced casual interaction within the domestic sphere. The house became less of an open, flowing space and more of a series of contained boxes, each with a specific purpose and a designated inhabitant. It was like the home became a mini office building, with everyone getting their own cubicle by night. While the benefits of privacy and individual space were widely touted and eagerly embraced by those who could afford them, the legacy of communal sleeping didn't entirely disappear. Shared rooms continued out of necessity for many, and certain subcultures or living arrangements maintained more open, shared spaces. But the cultural ideal had shifted decisively. The image of the happy, healthy family in the mid-20th century increasingly featured children tucked away in their own beds, in their own rooms, perhaps with a nightlight casting a glow on their undisturbed sleep. The quiet solitude of the private bedroom had become the aspiration, a far cry from the bustling, shared sleeping spaces of centuries past. It was a new era of domestic life, one built on the foundation of personal boundaries, quiet retreat, and the belief that good sleep, like many other things, was best enjoyed alone, or at least mostly alone. So, with the concept of the private bedroom firmly taking root, especially among the middle and upper classes who could afford such luxuries, the stage was set for the next big domestic revolution, the rise and reign of the twin bed. This wasn't just about having your own room anymore, it was about having your own bed, even if you were sharing a room with your spouse. It seems bizarre to us now, maybe like something out of a particularly prudish period drama, but for a significant chunk of the 20th century, sleeping in separate beds, often side by side in the same room, became the aspirational standard for respectable married couples. It wasn't just a furniture choice, it was practically a moral and hygienic statement. Think about the forces at play here. We just talked about the growing emphasis on privacy and the individual self within the home. Combine that with the lingering anxieties around hygiene, those pesky invisible germs. Remember our dive into germ theory? It wasn't just for hand washing. And a dose of evolving, or perhaps just confused, ideas about marital intimacy. The shared double bed, once a symbol of conjugal unity, began to be viewed by some as slightly uncouth, perhaps even unsanitary, and definitely disruptive to a good night's sleep. After all, who wants to be woken up by their partner's tossing and turning, or worse, their snoring? Speaking of snoring, if you find yourself nodding off right now, maybe blame the monotonous sound of my voice, not your fictional sleeping partner. Furniture manufacturers and mattress companies were, unsurprisingly, quick to capitalize on these shifting anxieties and aspirations. They weren't just selling beds anymore, they were selling a lifestyle, a vision of modern, healthy, and harmonious marriage. Advertisements from the early to mid-20th century are full of happy, rested-looking couples waking up refreshed in their identical twin beds. The messaging was clear. Separate beds equaled better sleep, and better sleep equaled a happier marriage and healthier individuals. It was a virtuous cycle powered by spring mattresses and crisp, separate sheets. The narrative often focused on the idea of undisturbed rest. Sharing a bed, the argument went, meant compromising your sleep quality. Every time your partner shifted, sneezed, or just breathed too loudly, your precious rest was interrupted. Twin beds, with their separation, ensured that your sleep was your own, free from the physical disturbances of another person. This aligned perfectly with the growing scientific and popular interest in the importance of sleep for health and productivity. Sleep wasn't just something you did, it was something you optimized. And apparently, optimal sleep for couples involved a physical divide. Hygiene was another major selling point. While germ theory had brought a new understanding of microscopic threats, it also fueled a certain level of anxiety about bodily closeness. Sharing a bed meant sharing body heat, sweat, and whatever airborne nasties your partner might be exhaling or harboring. Separate beds felt cleaner, more sanitary. It was a way of creating a small buffer zone, a hygienic cordon sanitaire in the marital bedroom. It sounds a bit ridiculous now, but at the time, with the newfound awareness of germs, this felt like a sensible precaution. You wouldn't share a toothbrush, would you? So maybe sharing a bed felt increasingly questionable. The style of twin beds reinforced this sense of neat separation. They were often perfectly matched. Identical frames, identical mattresses, identical bedding, placed parallel with a nightstand between them, or sometimes even in an L shape in larger rooms. They presented an image of orderly individual comfort within a shared space. It wasn't about rejecting the spouse, it was about optimizing the sleeping experience for both individuals within the marriage. The bedroom became less about the symbolic unity of the marital bed and more about providing each partner with their personal sleep station. It was the ultimate upgrade from a shared bunk bed to adjacent single pods. For some, particularly those coming from stricter Victorian backgrounds or simply wanting to maintain a certain level of perceived propriety, twin beds also offered a subtle nod to modesty. While the shared marital bed was socially accepted, its physical intimacy could be downplayed by the visual separation of twin beds. This is a slightly more speculative point, as overt discussions of marital intimacy were rare in public discourse, but it's plausible that twin beds appealed to a sense of refined distance for some couples. It offered a visual representation of separate, respectable individuals choosing to share a room rather than being physically intertwined all night. The mainstream historical fact here is the pervasive marketing push by the furniture and bedding industry in the first half of the 20th century that explicitly promoted twin beds as the ideal, modern, and healthy choice for married couples. This wasn't a grassroots movement. It was a carefully crafted campaign to change consumer behavior and sell more furniture. They used endorsements from doctors, cited, sometimes loosely, scientific studies on sleep, and created aspirational imagery in magazines and catalogs to make twin beds synonymous with progress in well-being and marriage. This trend wasn't just confined in North America. It spread throughout Western Europe and other parts of the world influenced by these cultural currents. The image of the twin-bedded marital room became common in films and literature, further cementing its status as the norm, or at least the ideal, for a modern, respectable home. You'd see the husband and wife portrayed climbing into their separate beds, perhaps exchanging a chaste goodnight kiss across the gap or over the shared nightstand. It was a different kind of intimacy than the historical shared bed. Less physical co-presence through the night, more intentional moments of connection before lights out. A quirky or fringe tidbit from this era or series is the invention and brief popularity of sweetheart or cuddle beds in the early 20th century. These were essentially twin beds designed with a slight curve or a shared headboard that allowed the occupants' heads to be closer together while their bodies remained in separate beds. Some even had a small, shared section at the head where partners could hold hands. This attempted to bridge the gap created by twin beds, acknowledging a desire for precipitation while still adhering to the separation ideal. It's a little sad and sweet at the same time, finding architectural workarounds for a closeness that was being designed out of the room. Imagine the sales pitch. Get the health benefits of separation, plus the emotional benefit of being able to just about reach out and touch, but not too much, mind you. The peak of the twin bed era is generally considered to be from the 1920s through the 1950s. During this time, if you were setting up a modern bedroom, especially for a newly married couple. Twin beds were often the default suggestion. Double beds were still around, of course, often relegated to guest rooms or seen as slightly less advanced, or perhaps more working class. Remember how separation became a status symbol? The aspiration was clearly the twin set. It felt like a technological upgrade for sleep. Historians still argue whether the twin bed trend was primarily driven by genuine health concerns, effective marketing manipulation, or deeper cultural shifts regarding individualism and privacy within marriage. Was it a rational response to new information about hygiene and sleep science? Or was it a clever way for the furniture industry to double its sales by convincing couples they needed two beds instead of one? It's likely a mix of all these factors, tangled up like tangled sheets on a double bed probably. The interesting thing is how completely this ideal has flipped. For most couples in Western cultures today, the double or queen or king-size bed is the unquestioned norm for a marital bedroom. Twin beds are for kids' rooms, guest rooms, or perhaps very specific circumstances. The idea of actively choosing to sleep in separate single beds as a standard practice feels alien, even slightly odd or indicative of marital problems to a modern sensibility. But for decades, it was the sign of having made it, of being modern and health conscious. Part of this shift back to shared beds likely happened as germ anxieties evolved. We learned more about how diseases actually spread and realized sharing a bed wasn't generally a major vector for everyday illnesses unless one partner was actively sick. And as cultural attitudes towards intimacy and partnership changed, the focus moved from separate physical spaces to shared emotional and physical connection as a cornerstone of marriage, symbolized by the shared bed. The idea of co-sleeping became popular again, not just for convenience or warmth, but for emotional closeness and intimacy. Also, let's be honest, navigating two separate beds for any kind of, shall we say, nocturnal activities, other than sleeping presents logistical challenges. While the primary function of a bed is sleep, it's not the only function in a marital bedroom. Perhaps the practicalities of intimacy eventually outweighed the perceived benefits of undisturbed sleep and hygiene for many couples. Or maybe people just miss the physical comfort of having another warm body nearby, even if they did snore a bit. So the era of the twin bed as the marital ideal was relatively short-lived in the grand sweep of history, maybe 50, 60 years at its peak. But it was a powerful cultural moment, shaped by industry, health trends, and evolving social norms. It reinforced the idea of the bedroom as a place for individual rest, even within the partnership, and cemented the bedroom as a private, contained space within the home, furthering that architectural and social segmentation we discussed earlier. It was a time when sleep was so important and germs were so feared that couples literally drew a line down the middle of their bedroom floor, or rather, put two distinct beds side by side to ensure their personal well-being, even if it meant sacrificing some physical closeness. It was peak individuality in the domestic nightscape. So the shared sleeping patterns of the classical world, far from disappearing with the toga and the legionary boot, flowed like an undercurrent into the medieval period. As the Roman Empire fragmented and reshaped into the kingdoms and societies we recognize as the Middle Ages, life became different in many ways. The architecture changed, the political structures shifted, the religious landscape was transformed. But the fundamental reality of most people sharing their living and sleeping space remained remarkably constant. You might imagine knights in shining armor, or ladies in elaborate gowns, but picture them settling down for the night. And for the vast majority, that picture involves other people, often quite a few other people, in the same room, potentially even the same bed. Life for the average person, especially the peasantry who made up the vast majority of the population, was centered around small, often single-room homes. These weren't sprawling villas. Think more along the lines of a sturdy hut or a small cottage, typically made of timber, wattle and daub, or stone, with a thatched or tiled roof. Heating came from a central hearth, the smoke often finding its way out through a hole in the roof or simply filling the space before slowly dissipating. This single room, sometimes with a small lean-to or loft, served every purpose: cooking, eating, working, socializing, And of course, sleeping. The entire family unit, sometimes extended family, would share this space. Beds as we know them were rare luxuries. Instead, people slept on straw pallets, mats, or perhaps simple wooden frames piled with bedding. And these sleeping surfaces were shared. Parents would share a pallet, and children would pile onto another, or perhaps share with grandparents or other relatives living under the same roof. The warmth of bodies huddled together wasn't just about comfort, it was often a matter of survival, especially during long, cold winters. You didn't have central heating, remember? And insulating a simple hut was a losing battle. Huddling was energy-efficient body heat transfer, the original thermal blanket technology. This mainstream historical fact is undeniable. Communal sleeping in the main living area was the norm in peasant homes throughout the medieval period. The concept of a dedicated bedroom was virtually unknown to this social class. Sleep was simply another activity that happened in the shared space, a functional necessity that followed the evening meal and preceded the morning's work. The sounds you'd hear wouldn't just be snoring, though there would be plenty of that, no doubt. You'd hear the settling of animal kept indoors for warmth and security, the rustling of straw, the creaks of the structure, and the ambient noises of the village or farmstead outside. Even among the more affluent, privacy as we understand it was a foreign concept. Castles and manor houses were larger, with multiple rooms, but these rooms were primarily functional and often multi-purpose. The Great Hall was the center of activity, dining, receiving guests, administering justice, and yes, often sleeping. People would sleep on the floor of the Great Hall, or in other chambers, on pallets or beds. Even the lord and lady of the manor, while they might have a more private chamber, solars or chambers, would not sleep alone. Attendants, servants, or even guards would often sleep in the same room or just outside the door. The idea was constant attendance, security, and access, rather than personal solitude. Consider the sheer number of people often residing in a castle or manor house. Besides the lord and his family, there would be knights, squires, ladies-in-waiting, household servants, cooks, stable hands, and many others. Accommodating everyone meant maximizing space, and that inevitably led to shared sleeping quarters. Rooms were often large and might contain multiple beds or designated sleeping areas. There was no expectation that each individual, even among the nobility's retinue, would have their own private space for the night. It was a communal enterprise, a large, bustling household that quieted down at night, but didn't empty out into individual rooms. A quirky tidbit from this era involves sleeping posture. While we tend to sleep lying flat today, there's some evidence to suggest that sleeping in a more upright or semi-reclined position was common for some, possibly due to factors like poor ventilation, the need for quick readiness, or even concerns about digestion or spirits. Illustrations from the period sometimes depict people propped up in bed with pillows or cushions. While it wasn't universal, it adds another layer to how different their sleep experience was. Not necessarily sprawling out horizontally, but maybe arranged vertically in their shared space, like books on a slightly messy shelf. Communal sleeping was also the standard in institutions. Medieval inns, much like their Roman predecessors, offered little in the way of private rooms. Travelers would typically share large sleeping chambers, often sleeping on straw or rudimentary beds side by side with strangers of varying degrees of cleanliness and trustworthiness. You might arrive at an inn after a long day's journey, hoping for a good rest, only to find yourself bunking down with a snoring merchant, a smelly soldier, and someone who looks suspiciously like they might borrow your purse while you asleep. It makes a bad hotel review seem positively glowing by comparison. Room was shared with 3 strangers and a goat. Bedding smelled vaguely of regret and damp straw. Oh, 5 stars. Hospitals, which often originated as charitable or religious institutions, also featured communal sleeping arrangements. The focus was on care, but not individual privacy. Patients would share large wards, sleeping in beds or on pallets lined up together. While this offered mutual support and easier monitoring by caregivers, it also meant that illness, smells, sounds, and discomfort were shared experiences day and night. Imagine trying to recover from an illness or injury with a dozen other people coughing, groaning, and generally being unwell all around you. It gives ward round a whole new meaning. Historians still argue whether the prevalence of shared sleeping arrangements in the medieval period reflected a fundamentally different cultural attitude towards privacy and individualism compared to modern times, or if it was simply a practical necessity dictated by economic constraints, living conditions, and security concerns. Was the constant proximity of others a natural and accepted state of being, fostering communal bonds and a lack of self-consciousness about personal habits? Or was there an underlying desire for privacy that was simply impossible to achieve for most, leading to social pressures and constraints we can only guess at? It's a complex question, trying to understand the internal experience of people whose external lives were so inextricably intertwined. Bedding itself was a far cry from our multi-layered, temperature-controlled setups. Straw was the most common filling for mattresses or pallets, offering minimal support and attracting pests. Wool, flock, shredded fabric, or feathers might be used by the wealthier, but even these would be lumpy, uneven, and difficult to keep clean. Blankets were typically wool or linen. Sheets, if used at all, were a luxury. The sheer amount of life happening in close proximity, humans, animals, insects, meant that a clean and pest-free sleeping surface was a constant battle. You weren't just sharing your bed with family. You might be sharing it with fleas, lice, and other unwelcome guests who didn't pay rent. The practicalities of life dictated these arrangements. Homes were small, heat was scarce, and light was precious. Gathering together at night maximized warmth and made the most of limited light sources for evening activities before sleep. Security was also a factor. Sleeping together offered a degree of collective protection against intruders, human or animal. Furthermore, the social structure itself reinforced communal living. Families were economic units, working the land or practicing a craft together. Servants and apprentices lived within the master's household, integrated into the daily rhythm, including nighttime rest. So as the centuries of the Middle Ages rolled on, from the early post-Roman kingdoms through the High Middle Ages and towards the late medieval period, the pattern held. Shared sleeping wasn't just common, it was the default setting for society, regardless of whether you were a peasant farmer, a craftsman in a bustling town, a monk in a monastery, where monks slept communally in dormitories, a soldier in a barracks, a traveler in an inn, or even a noble in a castle surrounded by your retinue. The idea of a room or even a bed truly being yours and yours alone for the night remained a distant concept, something only glimpsed by the absolute elite, and even then, it rarely meant solitary confinement for sleep. This ingrained habit of sharing space for rest would continue to shape how people lived and interacted for centuries to come, laying the groundwork for the gradual shifts that would eventually, much, much later, begin to introduce the concept of a private bedroom. But we're still a long way from that comfy, solitary bed you're probably snuggled into right now. So we've settled ourselves, virtually speaking, into the bustling communal sleeping spaces of the Middle Ages. And for centuries, that was the tune everyone slept to. A chorus of snores and rustling straw in shared rooms. But history doesn't stand still, even when everyone's tucked in together. As the medieval period waned and the ripples of the Renaissance began to spread across Europe, subtle changes started to appear in the way people lived and occasionally how they slept. This wasn't a sudden flip of a switch. You didn't wake up one morning in 1492 suddenly demanding your own room. It was a slow, creeping evolution, more like watching paint dry than a dramatic revolution. One of the key drivers of this slow shift was changing economic fortunes for certain segments of society. The growth of trade, the rise of cities, and the increasing complexity of economies led to the emergence of a wealthier merchant class and a more prosperous gentry. These weren't necessarily old money aristocrats living in sprawling castles, but successful townsfolk, lawyers, doctors, or landowners who accumulated enough wealth to build or significantly renovate their homes. And with more wealth came the desire and the ability to live in slightly more comfort and, crucially, with a little more space. This increasing prosperity meant that some homes started to have more rooms than the traditional single-hall house of the peasant. While the Great Hall often remained the heart of the home for dining and social gatherings, people began to add smaller chambers, parlors, or withdrawing rooms. These additional spaces serve various purposes: receiving guests privately, conducting business, or providing separate areas for different family members or activities during the day. And sometimes these new rooms were used, at least partially, for sleeping. This is where we see the first tentative steps towards what might eventually, centuries later, become the concept of a dedicated bedroom. A mainstream historical fact is that the late medieval and early Renaissance periods saw the construction of homes, particularly among the burgeoning middle and upper classes, that incorporated more specialized rooms compared to earlier periods. These were often called chambers and might serve as a combination sitting room, dressing room, and bedroom, sometimes even containing a privy or access to one. They offered a degree of separation from the main communal space, a place where a family or privileged individuals within a household could retreat. However, let's not get ahead of ourselves and picture these as private suites. Even in these more elaborate chambers, the idea of solitary sleep was still extremely rare. The chamber might be shared by a husband and wife, but also their young children, a nursemaid, personal servants, or even trusted guests. The bed itself, often a substantial wooden structure with curtains or hangings, which became increasingly elaborate and expensive status symbols, might dominate the room, but it wasn't just for one or two people. Attendants might sleep on pallets or smaller beds at the foot of the main bed or along the walls. Security, accessibility, and the social norms of having servants constantly on hand meant that these private chambers were private only in the sense of being less public than the Great Hall. You might have your own room, but you definitely weren't guaranteed to have it to yourself at night. It's like upgrading from a hostel dorm to a shared Airbnb room. Definitely an improvement, but still not your own place. The furniture itself tells a story. While basic pallets and shared communal sleeping surfaces remained the norm for the vast majority, the beds of the wealthy became increasingly sophisticated. Four-poster beds with intricate carvings, rich textiles, and heavy curtains served multiple purposes. They were status symbols displaying wealth and taste. They provided a degree of physical enclosure and warmth in drafty rooms, and the curtains offered a visual barrier, creating a room-within-a-room effect. This was privacy within a shared space, rather than the privacy of a dedicated, solitary room. Imagine having a luxurious tent set up inside your living room, which you share with 3 other people, and maybe a very quiet, well-behaved dog. That's closer to the reality. A quirky tidbit from this period is the continued use, particularly in England, of the truckle bed or trundle bed. This was a low bed on wheels that could be rolled out from under a larger main bed at night and stored away during the day. These were often used by servants, children, or attendants sleeping in the same chamber as their masters or parents. It's a perfect illustration of how space was still being maximized. And even in rooms that were beginning to offer a hint of privacy for the primary occupants, space was still found for others to sleep close by. Oh, you want to sleep near the fancy bed? Great, just roll out this little number from underneath. Try not to hit your head. The concept of personal privacy, distinct from family or household privacy, was still very much an evolving idea. Life was lived more collectively. Doors didn't always have locks, and knocking before entering wasn't a universal courtesy. People were used to the constant presence of others, and the sounds, smells, and activities that came with it. Sleeping in a shared room wasn't necessarily seen as an imposition. It was simply the default mode of existence. It was the practical solution to housing everyone, keeping warm, and maintaining security. Historians still argue whether the emergence of these more numerous chambers and the increasing use of beds with hangings represented a deliberate cultural shift towards valuing personal privacy, or if they were simply functional developments driven by increased wealth, changing household structures, and the desire for comfort and display. Was it an intentional step towards individualism, or an unintentional byproduct of having more space and money? It's difficult to know the motivations and feelings of people centuries ago, especially regarding something as internal as the desire for solitude during sleep. For the vast majority of the population, farmers, laborers, lower status craftsmen, life and sleep remained much as it had been for centuries. They continued to live in 1 or 2 room homes, sleeping communally on pallets around the hearth with their families and sometimes their animals. The subtle changes happening in the homes of the wealthy didn't trickle down to them for a very long time. Their reality was dictated by necessity, not nascent ideals of privacy. The smells were still wood smoke, damp earth, and livestock. The sounds were still snoring, shifting bodies, and the rustle of straw. Even in institutions, communal sleeping remained standard. Inns still crammed travelers into shared rooms. Hospitals, despite advances in medicine, slow as they were, still featured large wards filled with beds side by side. Monasteries maintained their dormitories. Military barracks housed soldiers together. The pattern of shared space for sleeping was deeply ingrained across society, a practical response to the realities of housing, heating, and security in a pre-industrial world. The beautiful curtained beds of the wealthy in their chambers might look like a step towards modern bedrooms in paintings, but they were still islands of semi-privacy in a sea of communal living. The people sleeping around the main bed weren't just furniture, they were part of the household, their presence expected and accepted. This period, then, is less about the invention of the private bedroom and more about the introduction of spaces that offered a greater degree of privacy than had previously been common, particularly for the principal occupants. It was a preview of coming attractions, a hint of the future where space might eventually be allocated for individual sleep. But that future was still centuries away for most people. The slow, glacial movement towards valuing solitary sleep had begun, but for now, sharing your sleeping space, even in nicer digs, was still very much the order of the night. You might be feeling a little snug right now, nestled into your own space, perhaps under your own duvet. Maybe you even have a door you can close. If you're sharing, it's likely with someone that you chose to share with, a partner, a close family member, maybe a very lucky pet. This wasn't the norm for most of human history, as we've seen. We've trudged through smoky, single-room longhouses, navigated crowded medieval halls, and even glimpsed the slightly less packed chambers of the wealthy in the late medieval period. But those hints of separation were just that, hints. The real seismic shift that cemented the idea of the private bedroom, the kind you're probably experiencing now, is intrinsically linked to the era we often call the modern age, propelled largely by the whirlwind changes of the Industrial Revolution. Think about the transition we discussed, a slow creep towards slightly more rooms in some houses. Now inject the explosive energy of industrialization. Suddenly you have factories, mills, generating immense wealth for a new class of industrialists, entrepreneurs, and a growing professional and managerial class. This wasn't just a few wealthy merchants. This was a broader segment of society gaining disposable income. And with this wealth came new aspirations and new possibilities for how one could live. Urbanization exploded. People flocked from the countryside to the new industrial cities seeking work. This created an unprecedented demand for housing, and builders and developers responded by constructing houses on a scale and with a uniformity never seen before. This is where a mainstream historical fact comes into play. The rise of the terraced house, or row house, in the 18th and 19th centuries, particularly in Britain and other industrializing nations. These houses, built side by side along streets, weren't just larger than peasant cottages. They were designed with multiple rooms on different floors. You had a front parlor, a dining room, a kitchen, and crucially, on the upper floors, dedicated rooms intended primarily for sleeping. This multi-room layout provided the physical architecture necessary for the concept of specialized spaces within the home to flourish. It was a game changer. Suddenly, having different rooms for different functions was not just a luxury for the elite, but an attainable reality for the burgeoning middle classes. You could actually go somewhere just to sleep, separate from where you ate or entertained. Revolutionary. Along with the changing physical structure of homes came a profound shift in social values. The concept of personal privacy, which had been relatively fluid and less emphasized in earlier, more communal societies, began to solidify and gain significant cultural weight. In the Victorian era in particular, the home became idealized as a sanctuary from the harsh, competitive public world of work. And within this sanctuary, different rooms served different aspects of family life. The parlor was for formal entertaining, the dining room for meals, and the upper floors, the bedrooms, were designated as the most private spaces in the house. The bedroom became the place where you retreated for rest, for personal hygiene rituals, using a washstand, for instance, before widespread indoor plumbing, and for activities considered intimate or personal, like dressing. The idea of sleeping communally with non-family members, or even extended family members, began to be seen as less respectable, associated with poverty, overcrowding, and a lack of refinement. A respectable middle-class family would strive to have enough bedrooms so that parents had their own, children shared only with siblings of the same sex, if necessary, and servants slept in designated areas, often smaller, less comfortable rooms, perhaps in the attic or basement, away from the family's private quarters. This wasn't just about comfort. It was deeply intertwined with emerging ideas about health, morality, and social status. Sleeping in overcrowded, poorly ventilated rooms was increasingly linked to the spread of disease, a valid concern, though the understanding of germs was still developing. Simultaneously, Victorian morality placed a high value on modesty and the separation of the sexes, which made communal sleeping spaces involving unrelated adults or adolescents of different genders seem improper. The private bedroom became a physical manifestation of these new values: cleanliness, respectability, and the ordered separate spheres of family life. Consider the furniture that became standard in these new bedrooms. The elaborate curtain beds of the wealthy from earlier periods evolved into simpler, but still substantial bed frames designed for one or two people. Wardrobes and chests of drawers replaced shared chests used for storing everyone's belongings in a communal space. Washstands with basins and pitchers became common, facilitating private hygiene routines. And yes, a quirky tidbit, the chamber pot was a ubiquitous and essential piece of bedroom furniture in this era, serving as a private, albeit temporary, solution before indoor plumbing became widespread. Imagine the logistics of emptying all those pots every morning. It certainly added a unique aroma to the dawn, far from the lavender sleep sprays of today. The ideal of the private bedroom wasn't instantly achievable for everyone. The working classes, living in smaller, less well-built houses or tenements, often continued to share rooms, or even beds, out of necessity well into the 20th century. Overcrowding remained a significant problem in urban areas, but the aspiration changed. Having a private bedroom became a symbol of having made it, a sign of moving up the social ladder. It represented a degree of security, health, and respectability that was unavailable to those living in cramped, shared quarters. Historians still argue whether the driving force behind the adoption of the private bedroom was primarily a genuine concern for health and sanitation, or if it was more about reinforcing new middle-class social norms, morality, and the desire to distinguish oneself from the unwashed masses. Was it a practical response to the realities of urban life and emerging medical understanding, or a cultural construct designed to reinforce class boundaries and control behavior? It's likely a complex mix of factors, as most historical changes are. The public health reformers certainly pushed for better ventilation and less crowding, while moralists emphasized modesty and the sanctity of the family unit within its private space. The 20th century saw the continued spread of the private bedroom ideal. As standards of living rose, even working-class families could increasingly afford houses or apartments with multiple rooms. Government housing programs and building codes began to incorporate standards for room size and occupancy, further solidifying the expectation that bedrooms were for limited numbers of people, ideally one or two. Indoor plumbing and electricity transformed the bedroom again, making hygiene easier and allowing for personal reading or activities after dark without disturbing others. The sounds of the modern bedroom, if you were to capture them, would be starkly different from the historical soundscape. Less snoring from multiple bodies, fewer rustling straw pallets. Gone are the animal noises or the murmur of communal conversation that accompanied sleep. Instead, you might hear the quiet click of a reading lamp, the hum of an electronic device charging, perhaps the soft noise of a partner breathing, or maybe just the sound of your own thoughts swirling in the quiet. It's a soundscape of solitude, or at most, intimate partnership. This shift wasn't just about where you slept, It was about a fundamental change in the relationship between the individual, the family, and the concept of personal space. For millennia, sleeping was a social activity, a time when the household gathered together, sharing warmth, security, and presence. It was a public-private blend where the boundaries were porous and flexible. The modern era, catalyzed by industrial change and evolving social values, gradually erected walls, literal and metaphorical, around the act of sleeping. Today, we take the private bedroom for granted. The idea of sleeping communally with strangers or even distant relatives feels odd, maybe even uncomfortable or unsafe. We value having our own space, a place to retreat, to be alone, to sleep undisturbed, or disturbed only by people we choose to be disturbed by, like a partner's snoring, which somehow feels different when it's your partner. This expectation is a relatively recent historical development, a product of economic changes, architectural innovations, and a cultural evolution that prioritized individual privacy in ways our ancestors would have found baffling, perhaps even lonely. So the next time you settle into your own bed, in your own room, perhaps closing the door behind you, take a moment to appreciate the long, strange journey humanity took to get here. From huddling together for warmth and security in smoky huts, to sharing beds with multiple strangers in noisy inns, to sleeping surrounded by servants in drafty chambers. The history of how we sleep is a history of society itself, of changing economies, evolving technologies, shifting social norms, and the slow, winding path towards the very modern, very specific kind of solitude we now associate with drifting off to sleep. It's a story that puts your simple act of getting into bed tonight into a whole new, slightly less simple, historical perspective. And perhaps, just maybe, that perspective is boring enough to finally lull you into peaceful sleep. All right, our journey through the history of boring sleep is drawing to a close. We've covered a vast expanse of time, from prehistoric caves to your very own room tonight. We've explored how people huddled, piled, and occasionally found slivers of privacy in ways that feel utterly alien to us now. The smells, the sounds, the sheer crowdedness of sleep through the ages. It's a stark contrast to the quiet, solitary ritual many of us observe tonight. As the images of smoky halls and rustling straw begin to fade, and the historical voices quiet down, let the sense of your own comfortable space wash over you. Feel the soft texture beneath you, the gentle weight of your blankets. Breathe in the familiar air of your room. This quietude, this personal boundary around your sleep, is a luxury hard-won over millennia, a testament to countless small shifts in how humanity lived and rested. There's nothing more to think about, nothing more to learn tonight. The history is complete, the story told. Just focus on the feeling of letting go, the soft surrender to sleep. Allow your mind to drift, the historical figures and facts receding like a tide. You are here now, safe and sound, in your own time, in your own space. Sleep is calling. Just close your eyes, relax your muscles, and let yourself sink gently down, 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 towards sleep.